She stood in front of 10,000 wolves and watched the man she loved choose someone else. No warning, no farewell, just a crown lifted from her head and placed on another woman's hair while the entire kingdom held its breath. They called it a ceremony. She called it an execution. And when Seraphine Ashvale walked out of that arena with her spine straight and her hands steady, nobody knew she was already carrying his children. Nobody knew she was already gone. Stay with me until the end. This story will wreck you in the best possible way. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my pack is watching from tonight. Pasik. The moon ascension ceremony had not been held in 31 years. The last time the kingdom of Vilethorn gathered beneath the Silvermark Arch to witness a Luna crowning, Theron Blackridge's own father had stood in that torchlight with his hands trembling and his voice cracking, placing a wreath of blackthorn and moonstone on the head of a woman who would bear him 2 sons and outlive him by 16 years. The old king had wept that night, not from sentiment, the man had no sentiment in him, but from the weight of it, the sheer crushing gravity of what it meant to bind yourself to another person before every alpha, every elder, every oath-sworn wolf in the realm. Theron had been 7 years old. He'd stood in the second row with his boots too tight and his collar starched against his throat, and he'd watched his father weep and decided, with the absolute certainty of a child who understands nothing and believes everything, that he would never be that weak. He was 38 years old now, and he still believed it. The Silvermark Arch rose 60 feet above the ceremonial floor, twin columns of pale granite threaded through with veins of obsidian that caught the torchlight and held it, the way old stone holds heat, reluctantly and longer than it should. 300 torches lined the processional lane. The crowd packed the arena tiers 10 bodies deep, wolves from every corner of Vilethorn, from the salt frost packs of the northern coast to the red sand clans who'd ridden 3 days through the desert basin just to witness this moment. 14 packs. 47 sworn territories. All of them here, all of them watching, all of them already murmuring about Seraphine Ashvale, because Seraphine Ashvale had been the presumed Luna for 4 years, and everybody in this kingdom knew it. She had not been presumed. She had been promised, not in writing. Theron didn't do things in writing when he could avoid it, but she had stood beside him at every territorial summit for 4 years. She had negotiated the grain accord with the eastern packs when drought hit the lower valleys, and Theron's council was still arguing about whose fault it was. She had ridden with him into the Greywood during the border skirmish. No armor, just a short sword and the kind of steady hands that don't shake in the dark. She had sat across from him in the strategy room at 2 a.m. with maps spread across the table and ink on her fingers, and told him things no one else would tell him. That his tariff structure was bleeding the river packs dry, that his head of border security was taking bribes, that his pride was going to cost him alliances he couldn't afford to lose. He had listened. He had changed things. And then, 14 months ago, he had met Lady Vesper Rowan at the Autumn Council. That was the crack in the foundation. That was where the stone first gave. Seraphine Ashvale stood now in the preparation chamber beneath the arena, and she did not know about the crack. She knew about Vesper. Everyone knew about Vesper. It was impossible not to. The woman moved through court like smoke through a doorframe, everywhere and nowhere, scented and insubstantial and somehow always present in rooms she hadn't been invited to. But Seraphine had told herself it was politics. She had told herself Theron was strategic, that Vesper Rowan's family controlled 3 trade routes through the mountain passes, that proximity was not the same as preference. She had been wrong about that. She stood in front of the bronze mirror in the preparation chamber and looked at herself and tried to find something to criticize, because she was the kind of woman who used criticism as armor, who cataloged her own flaws before anyone else could use them as weapons. Her hair was dark and heavy, braided back from her temples the way court protocol required, the rest of it falling loose between her shoulder blades. Her gown was deep silver gray, the Ashvale color, no embellishments except the small crescent clasp at her collar that her mother had given her when she left home at 17. She was not soft-looking, she never had been. There was something angular and self-contained about her face, the kind of face that people sometimes called cold until they made her laugh, and then they understood that it wasn't cold at all. It was just private, locked, a room with a key she didn't hand out casually. Theron had the key. She had given it to him in the 3rd year. in a watchtower at the edge of the Greywood during a rainstorm when he'd looked at her in the particular way he had. Not tender exactly, but focused, like she was the only fixed point in his field of vision. And she'd said something honest without meaning to. Something she'd never said out loud before. He hadn't responded with words. He'd just reached over and covered her hand with his, and that had been enough. That had been the moment. She was thinking about that moment now, standing in front of the bronze mirror, when the door to the preparation chamber opened and Marin Aldrich came in without knocking. Marin was her senior attendant and oldest friend, a compact woman of 40, with iron gray hair and the disposition of someone who has seen most of what the world has to offer and found it lacking. She had served in Theron's court for 12 years before Seraphine arrived, and she had watched enough Luna ceremonies and royal appointments and strategic marriages to have developed a nose for what she called the rot under the floorboards. Her face, when she came through the door, was wrong. "Marin," Seraphine turned from the mirror. "What is it?" It wasn't a question. They'd known each other too long for questions. Marin closed the door behind her. She didn't move farther into the room. She stood with her back against the door and her hands flat at her sides, and Seraphine watched something move across her face that she had never seen there before. Something that looked impossibly like grief. "Tell me," Seraphine said. "The order of procession has been changed." The words arrived without weight at first. Seraphine heard them and turned them over and waited for the weight to settle, the way you wait for pain after a cut. There's always that one clean second before it starts. "When?" "An hour ago. The protocol master received new instructions directly from the Alpha King's personal secretary." "What instructions?" Marin looked at her. Not around her, not past her, directly at her, the way a person looks at someone they love when they're about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "Lady Vesper Rowan will process second," Marin said, "from the west entrance, with the King's honor guard." Seraphine was quiet for 3 full seconds. "And I," she said, "will process. You will not be in the procession." The silence in the room was total. Outside, through the stone walls, she could hear the crowd. 10,000 wolves and the ambient noise they made just by existing, breathing and shifting and talking, and the low vibration of pack energy building toward a ceremony that was about to become something none of them expected. Seraphine heard all of it and registered none of it, because the inside of her skull had gone very quiet and very still, the way places go still right before something violent happens in them. "He didn't tell me himself," she said. "No. He sent a secretary." "Yes." She turned back to the mirror. She looked at herself, the silver gray gown, the braided temples, the crescent clasp her mother had given her. She thought about the watchtower and the rainstorm and his hand covering hers, and she felt something inside her chest make a sound like old timber under new weight, a deep, structural groan that no one else could hear. "Help me with my hair," she said. "Seraphine, help me with my hair, Marin." Marin came across the room and stood behind her at the mirror, and her hands, when she reached up to work loose the ceremonial braid, were not quite steady. Seraphine watched them in the mirror and said nothing. She looked at her own face and thought, very clearly, if you cry, you are finished. If you cry in this room before you walk out of this building, you will never recover from it. You will spend the rest of your life being the woman who cried in the preparation chamber while another woman took her place. She did not cry. She let Marin take down the braid. She stood still while her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She unclasped the crescent at her collar and put it in her pocket because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her wear her mother's jewelry to her own humiliation. Then she walked to the door. "Don't go out there," Marin said. "You don't have to. You can leave. I can have horses ready in 20 minutes. "I'm not leaving," Seraphine said. "I'm going to watch." She watched from the 3rd tier, in the open public seating, surrounded by wolves who didn't recognize her, because why would they? The presumed Luna was supposed to be in the procession, not standing anonymously in the crowd in a silver gray gown with her hair loose and her face giving nothing away. She watched the torches flare. She watched the processional lane fill with honor guard, 40 wolves in black and silver, Theron's colors, their armor catching the light as they moved in formation down the lane. She watched the crowd lift from its collective murmur to something approaching roar as the Alpha King emerged from the north entrance, Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, wearing his crown and his authority the way he wore everything, like it was simply part of his body, like he had never once in his life considered that he might not deserve it. She had loved that about him once, the certainty of him, the way he occupied space without apology. Standing in the third tier watching him walk toward the Silvermark Arch, she understood for the first time what that certainty had actually cost the people around him. Because a man that's certain never considers that he might be wrong. And a man who never considers that he might be wrong will eventually do something catastrophic and call it a decision. Vesper Rowan came through the west entrance. Seraphine had seen her before, of course, at the Autumn Council, at 3 or 4 diplomatic events over the past year. She was a striking woman, not beautiful in the classical court sense, but arresting, the kind of face that made you look twice, not because of symmetry, but because of intention, because there was something in her eyes that was always calculating the distance between where she was and where she meant to be. She was tall and fair, with gold pale hair swept up into an elaborate arrangement that someone had spent 3 hours constructing. Her gown was white, the Luna color, Seraphine noted, already, before the ceremony had even formally begun. She processed down the lane on the arm of Theron's head general, and the crowd's reaction was confused at first, a murmur of uncertainty, necks craning to look for Seraphine Ashvale in the procession where she should have been. But Vesper Rowan walked with the absolute composure of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time, and the honor guard flanked her, and the torches were very bright, and by the time she reached the arch, the confusion had not yet resolved into understanding. Theron met her at the arch. He took her hand. He didn't look for Seraphine in the crowd. He didn't look around at all. He was already somewhere else, already in the version of this night that he'd constructed in his own head, the version where whatever he was about to do was justified by the strategic calculus of it, by the trade routes and the mountain passes, and the political utility of binding Vesper Rowan's family resources to the crown. Seraphine knew, watching him, that he had probably convinced himself it was even, in some complicated masculine way, kind. Cleaner to do it this way than to tell her in advance. Cleaner to make the decision absolute before she could argue it. Because she would have argued it, and he knew it, and he did not want to hear the argument. The elder ritualist's voice carried across the arena, amplified by the arch's particular acoustic geometry, the way old stone conducts sound. People of Veilthorn, wolves of the 14 packs, we are gathered beneath the Silvermark Arch to witness the binding of our Alpha King, and to name before every pack, every territory, every oath-sworn wolf in this realm, the Luna who will stand beside him. The crowd was absolutely silent now. Alpha King Theron Blackridge, do you present your chosen Luna to this assembly, of your own will and in full authority as sovereign of Veilthorn? Theron's voice, when it came, was exactly what it always was. Level, certain, uninflected by anything that might be mistaken for doubt. I do. And who do you name? He turned to Vesper Rowan. Lady Vesper Rowan, he said, of the Rowan territories. I name her Luna of Veilthorn. The crowd broke. Not in celebration, in fracture, a dozen different reactions colliding simultaneously, wolves turning to each other with questions on their faces, voices rising in multiple registers, a sound like the moment before a fight, when everyone is still talking but no one is listening. Seraphine heard her own name said twice in the immediate vicinity, by people who had no idea she was standing among them, said with that particular northern pack inflection, Ashvale, where is Ashvale? And she kept her face entirely still and watched Theron lift the moonstone crown from its obsidian stand and settle it onto Vesper Rowan's pale hair. Vesper's eyes closed when the crown touched her head. Just for a moment, just long enough for Seraphine to see, across the distance of the arena floor and 3 tiers of crowd, that this was not the face of a woman who was surprised. The elder completed the binding words. Theron spoke them back. Vesper spoke hers. She had a low, precise voice, the kind that carries without effort, and she spoke her binding words with the fluency of someone who had practiced them. Of course she had practiced them. The torches flared. The crowd resolved eventually into something that approximated ceremonial response, the trained patterns of pack behavior overriding the confused individual reactions, because this was a Luna ceremony and the protocols had to be completed, the oaths had to be received, and Veilthorn had not survived 400 years of territorial conflict by failing to complete its ceremonies. Seraphine stayed until the crown was settled. She did not leave before that. She was not going to be a woman who ran, who gave them the image of her fleeing, who handed that story to the court gossips to shape however they liked. She watched the crown settle. Then she turned and walked quietly out of the tier and down the internal corridor and out through a side exit into the cold night air of the ceremonial courtyard, where the grass was frost-stiff under her feet, and the torchlight from the arena painted the sky amber above the walls. And she stood there in the dark by herself and breathed. In, out. The air came in cold and clean and tasted like coming winter, like the high-altitude clarity of mornings in the mountain territories where she'd grown up, and something about that specific cold, that particular clean sharpness, unlocked the thing she'd been holding together in her chest and let it move. She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she kept promises. But she put one hand flat against the courtyard wall, and she stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed and her forehead nearly touching the stone, breathing carefully, methodically, the way you breathe when you are managing something very large that wants to become unmanageable. She was thinking about the watchtower. She was thinking about his hand over hers. She was thinking about the child. She'd been certain for 6 weeks. She'd told no one, not even Marin, not yet. She'd been waiting for the ceremony, for the formal binding, for the moment when it would be appropriate to say, "I am carrying your heirs, and now we are bound by more than intention." She took her hand off the wall. She straightened. The thing she was managing stayed where she'd put it, compressed, contained, stored in the place behind her sternum, where she kept everything she couldn't afford to release in public. She would deal with it later. She would deal with all of it later, systematically, the way she dealt with everything, with clear eyes and a cold assessment of options. Right now, standing in the courtyard with the ambient noise of the ceremony still filtering through the walls, she needed to think. The first coherent thought that surfaced was, Vesper Rowan knew before tonight. Not a suspicion, a certainty. That face when the crown touched her hair, that was a woman receiving something she had already prepared a place for. Vesper Rowan had known she was going to be named Luna of Veilthorn before the ceremony began, which meant she and Theron had discussed it in advance, which meant this was not an impulse or a shift of feeling or even a strategic pivot. This was a plan. It had been a plan long enough for Vesper to practice her binding words and prepare her expression and commission a gown in the Luna color. While Seraphine had been negotiating grain accords and riding border skirmishes and sitting across tables at 2 a.m. telling him the truths no one else would. The second coherent thought was the child. She had her hand over her stomach before she consciously decided to put it there. There was nothing to feel yet. She was barely 6 weeks. There was nothing showing, nothing moving, just the subtle internal knowledge of her own body telling her something was different. Something had taken root. Something was growing in the dark with the unhurried patience of all things that are becoming. His children. The heirs of the Blackridge bloodline, growing inside a woman he had just publicly discarded. She did not think about what he would do if he knew. She refused to put that specific shape into her mind because she understood already, with the clear, precise intelligence that was her most consistent quality, that what Theron Blackridge would do if he knew depended entirely on what was useful to him, and she would not trust the safety of her children to what was useful to Theron Blackridge. She thought about the mountains, her mother's territory, 3 days' hard ride north and east above the timberline, where the air was thin and the roads were bad and the people were spare and self-sufficient and did not care much about the politics of Veilthorn's capital. She had not been back in 7 years. There were people there who still remembered her. The elder midwife, the packmaster who'd trained her with a short sword when she was 12, the woman who ran the only way station on the Upper Pass Road. She thought about what it would take to disappear, not flee. Disappear. Quietly, methodically, without drama, without leaving the kind of messy trail that people spend years chasing. She had contacts in 3 territories outside Veilthorn. She had her own finances, modest but real, separate from the court allowances she'd never relied on because she had never trusted resources she didn't personally control. She had Marin, who had said, "I can have horses ready in 20 minutes." She had not taken her up on it. She was considering it now. The side door opened behind her and she turned, half expecting Marin, but it was not Marin. It was Corden Ashby, Theron's head of court intelligence, a lean, careful man of 50 with the particular stillness of someone whose entire professional existence depended on being unmemorable. He had 2 guards with him. He stopped when he saw her face, and she watched him recalibrate the way intelligence professionals recalibrate, rapidly, with minimal external indication. "Lady Ashvale," he said. "Corden. The Alpha King requests that you return to the preparation wing until the ceremony concludes." She looked at him for a moment. He was a decent man, or as decent as a man in his position could afford to be. She had always found him honest within the boundaries of his loyalty, and she had respected that, and she thought he probably respected it in her as well. "Does he?" she said. "It would be preferable," Corden said carefully, "if your departure from the ceremony weren't visible, for the stability of the event. For the optics, he meant. For the narrative. If Seraphine Ashvale was seen walking out of the moon ascension ceremony without tears and without theatrics, it created a story that was harder to control than the one they were trying to tell. The one where she was gracious, or devastated, or absent, where she fit neatly into the background of his decision. "Tell him," she said, "that I was never here." She walked past Corden and his guards and back through the side exit, and they let her go because she was right. The cleanest story for everyone was the one where she had never been present at all. The stables were on the western edge of the palace compound, a long walk across 3 courtyards in the cold. She made it in 11 minutes. Marin was already there, not with 2 horses, with 4, with 2 packed travel bags, provisions for 8 days, a sealed leather document case that Seraphine did not ask about and did not need to, and the calm efficiency of a woman who has spent 40 years being useful in situations that other people are still in the process of understanding. "You knew I'd come," Seraphine said. "I knew you'd think first," Marin said. "You always think first. But I also know what I watched you figure out in the time between when I told you and when you walked out of that chamber." Seraphine looked at the horses. Good ones. Mountain-bred, compact and deep-chested, built for altitude and bad roads. She did not ask where Marin had acquired mountain horses in the palace stables. Some things you don't ask. "There's something you don't know," Seraphine said. Marin looked at her, that direct, undeflected look. 6 weeks, Seraphine said. The silence between them was brief and absolute. Then Marin said, "How certain?" "Completely." Another silence. Marin let it exist for 2 full seconds, which was more than she usually gave any piece of information. Then she turned back to the horses and tightened a girth strap that was already correctly tightened. "The northern pass will be better than the eastern road," she said. "Fewer checkpoints." "My mother's territory," Seraphine said. "Yes." "She's going to—" "Yes," Marin said. "She is. Are you going to let her?" Seraphine pulled on the riding gloves that Marin had apparently packed in the top of the nearer bag, where she'd known she'd reach for them first. She flexed her hands inside the leather and looked up at the sky, where the moon was high and hard-edged, and absolutely indifferent to what was happening beneath it. "Yes," she said. They rode out through the servants' gate at the 3rd hour, which was the hour when the guards changed, and the overlap was a 10-minute window of reduced attention. The ceremony was still in its final ritual phase. She could hear the drums from the arena, the deep ceremonial rhythm that marked the binding's completion. The sound followed her out of the gate and along the outer road and for 2 miles into the dark. And then the distance swallowed it, and there was only the sound of hooves on cold ground and the wind coming down from the mountains. She did not look back. She had made that decision in the courtyard, holding herself together against the stone wall. She would not be a woman who looked back. Whatever she was going to be, whatever she was going to build out of what had just been taken from her, it was not going to be built facing the wrong direction. The Northern Pass road climbed steeply in the pre-dawn hours. The horses worked hard, their breath coming in plumes in the cold, and Seraphine rode with her body easy and her mind running calculations. Distance, timeline, resources. The elder midwife in her mother's territory was a woman named Gula, who had delivered half the pack's children over the past 30 years, and who had the discretion of someone who understands that some births are political, whether you want them to be or not. She didn't think about Theron. She thought about the twins. She didn't know yet it was twins. That knowledge was still 14 days away. A morning when Gula would look up from her examination with an expression that mixed professional surprise with something that was almost reverence and say, "There are two of them, Seraphine, there are two." But she thought about the child, or what she believed was one child, and she thought about names, and she thought about the mountain territory above the timberline where she'd learned to ride and fight and survive, and she thought about what it would mean to raise a Blackridge heir in a place where no one used that name. Marin rode beside her in companionable silence for a long time, and then when the sky was beginning to go from black to gray at the edges, she said, "He's going to regret it." "I know," Seraphine said. "That's not comfort." "No," Seraphine agreed. "It's not." The gray at the sky's edge became pale gold, became the first flat light of morning, and Valethorn's capital fell behind them with every mile, and the mountain territory rose ahead with the absolute patience of high places, the patience of things that have existed long before this particular woman's grief and will exist long after, which is not comfort exactly, but is something, on mornings when comfort is too small a thing to ask for. She was 8 days from the mountains. She was 6 weeks from a decision that Theron Blackridge had made for her without knowing all the variables. She rode north, and she did not look back. And the kingdom she was leaving did not know, could not know, would not know for years what it had just lost in that pre-dawn dark. Not a disgraced Luna fleeing in shame, but a woman with a back straight as old iron carrying in her body the truth that would eventually remake everything Theron Blackridge had built. The mountain air thinned around her as the road climbed, and she breathed it in, that particular sharpness she hadn't tasted in 7 years, and something in her, not healing, not yet, nothing that clean, but something restructuring, the internal architecture of a person remapping itself around a new load-bearing truth. She was not going to the mountains to hide. She was going to the mountains to build. She didn't know yet what she was building. She didn't know it would take 14 years, or that what came out of those 14 years would have 2 faces that looked like hers and 2 pairs of eyes that were entirely his, or that those 2 faces would walk into his kingdom one day with his bloodline in their veins and her iron in their spines, and that the kingdom would have no choice but to look at what it had discarded and call it by its true name. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew the road and the cold and the mountain ahead, and somewhere in the palace behind her a ceremony was concluding, and a crown was sitting on the wrong woman's head, and Theron Blackridge had no idea what he'd done. The morning Gula pressed her hands flat against Seraphine's abdomen and went still with professional intensity. Seraphine was looking at the ceiling of the mountain way station, where they'd been sheltering for 6 days while a late-season snowstorm closed the upper pass. "Be very still," Gula said. "I'm still." "Stiller." Seraphine stared at the rough-hewn ceiling and concentrated on breathing evenly. Outside, the storm worked on the shutters. The fire in the corner grate was the only warm thing for 100 miles in any direction. Gula was a woman of 60 with hands that had pulled more lives into the world than she'd ever bothered to count. And those hands were very quiet on Seraphine's skin now, and her face had gone into the focused absence of concentrated attention. Then she sat back. "Seraphine," she said, "tell me." Gula looked at her with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite alarm, but was something that contained elements of both, filtered through the steady professional calm of a woman who has presided over enough of life's major moments to understand that they require precision, not drama. "There are 2, she said. The fire popped in the grate. "2, Seraphine said. "Yes." The ceiling stared back at her. She cataloged the information the way she cataloged everything, received it, turned it over, assessed its dimensions, found the place in her internal architecture where it could be stored without compromising structural integrity. 2. Twins. Twin heirs of the Blackridge bloodline, growing in the body of the woman Theron Blackridge had publicly discarded 9 days ago in front of 10,000 wolves. "Are they strong?" Gula said. "Both strong, both there." She put her hands back over her stomach, the same involuntary gesture as the courtyard, the same instinctive shelter. And she looked at the ceiling of the way station while the storm worked on the shutters outside, and she thought about two names instead of one, and she thought about the mountain territory above the timberline, and she thought, with the cold precision that was her most reliable resource, about the scale of what Theron Blackridge had just set into motion without knowing he'd lit the fuse. He had rejected her to stabilize his Western alliance. What he had actually done was send his bloodline's legitimate heirs into the mountains to be raised by the one woman in the kingdom who would teach them, before she taught them anything else, that power is not given. It is built, year by year, in the cold and the dark and the altitude, by people who understand that survival is not the absence of suffering. It is the decision, made once and then remade every morning, to keep going. She let out a long, slow breath. Two names, she said, to no one in particular, to the ceiling, to the storm outside, to the two lives taking shape in the dark beneath her hands. Two names. And 14 miles up the road, through the storm, her mother's territory was waiting with its hard air and its hard-working people in enough distance from Valethorn that a woman could disappear into it so thoroughly that even a king's intelligence network would lose the thread. Because Corden Ashby was thorough, but thoroughness has limits, and the limits of Corden Ashby's reach ended at the northern timberline. She would build something here. She had no idea, lying in that way station with the storm screaming outside and Gula's steady presence in the corner, that what she was building would walk back into Valethorn 14 years later with its father's face and its mother's spine, and that when it did, the entire kingdom would have to make a choice about what it believed and who it had always served. She had no idea. But the two lives growing beneath her hands knew, in the wordless, preconscious certainty of things that are becoming, that the world they were entering had already decided something about them, and that they were going to spend the rest of their lives proving that decision wrong. Outside, the storm did not let up. Inside, Seraphine Ashvale closed her eyes and made the decision once, and began remaking it for the first morning of the rest of her life. And in the capital of Valethorn, in the palace that had been hers for 4 years and was now irrevocably someone else's, in the ceremony chamber where the torches had finally burned down to nothing, a new Luna sat beside a king who did not yet understand what he'd lost. And in the shadows of the western corridor where the guards changed at the 3rd hour every night, a small door stood ajar in the cold dark. The wind coming through it smelled like mountains. The storm broke on the 4th day. Not gently. Storms in the high northern territory don't break gently. They fracture, collapsing all at once the way exhausted things collapse, and then the sky goes a hard, clean blue that has no softness in it whatsoever, and the world below is buried under 3 feet of silence, and you can see for 50 miles in every direction with a clarity that feels almost punitive, like the mountains showing you exactly how far you are from anything. Seraphine stood at the way station window the morning the storm broke and looked at that 50 miles of clarity and understood, in the animal part of herself that had been running calculations since the courtyard, that she had made the right decision. Distance was not cowardice. Distance was geometry. You did not fight a battle from inside the enemy's walls when you had nothing yet to fight with. You went to ground, you built your strength, and you waited for the terrain to shift in your favor. She was 26 years old, and she was going to wait 14 years. She didn't know it would be exactly 14. She thought it might be 10 or 12, that there would be some threshold she'd recognize when she reached it. Some moment when the scales tipped and she would know it was time. What she didn't account for, couldn't account for standing at that window, was how completely 2 children could rewrite a person's calculations. How they would make the waiting not a strategy but a life. How she would look up one morning and find that the 10 years had become 14 and that Kaylin and Lucien were no longer the reason she was waiting. They were the reason the waiting was over. But that morning was 14 years away. First, there was the storm's aftermath and the Upper Pass Road opening and the last 2 days' ride into her mother's territory. Elara Ashvale, who met them at the territory line on horseback with no greeting and the particular expression of a woman who has been expecting bad news and is choosing her response very carefully. "How long have you been riding?" her mother said. 11 days. Elara looked at her daughter's face, and then at Marin, and then back at her daughter, and she did not ask the obvious question. She asked the one that mattered. "Are you hurt?" "No," Seraphine said. Her mother's eyes moved to her hands, which were holding the reins correctly, which meant she was holding the reins correctly on purpose, which meant something. Alara Ashvale had trained her daughter to ride at age 5, and she knew exactly what correct hands looked like when they were being performed rather than natural. "Come inside," she said. Inside, over a fire that her mother built with the focused efficiency of someone who knows that warmth is a practical matter and not a sentiment, Seraphine told her. Not everything at once, not the ceremony, and then the courtyard, and then Gula's hands on her skin, and the 2 heartbeats and the 2 names she still hadn't chosen. She told it in the order that it needed to be told, which was chronological and spare, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to deliver hard information to councils and border chiefs who needed facts and not feelings. Her mother listened without interrupting. This was unusual. Alara Ashvale interrupted frequently and without apology because she had strong opinions about most things, and no patience for letting other people finish sentences when she already knew where the sentence was going. She let Seraphine finish every sentence. When Seraphine was done, Alara stood up from the fire and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to the room, and Seraphine watched her mother's shoulders and waited. 2, Alara said. Yes. His. Yes. Another silence. Then her mother turned around, and her face was the particular closed-down expression of a woman who is managing something very large by refusing to give it any more space than it absolutely requires. Does he know? No. Are you going to tell him? No. Alara looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Good," and went to put the kettle on. And that was the entirety of her mother's response to the situation. And it was, Seraphine thought, exactly the right response. Not because it was warm, but because it was unambiguous. And in the high northern territory above the timberline, unambiguous was the closest thing to comfort that the landscape allowed. She named them on the 43rd day, Kaylin and Lucien. She'd had the names in her head almost from the beginning, 2 names that belonged to no one in either bloodline, that carried no obligation and no legacy, that were simply sounds she had chosen because they felt right in her mouth, because they had the particular weight of names that people grow into rather than names that are grown into people. They were born in early spring when the snowmelt was running fast in the creek behind the territory hall, and the air smelled of cold water and new mud and the thin, pale green of things that have survived a hard winter and are coming back anyway. Gula delivered them with the calm expertise of long practice, and Marin was there, and her mother was there, and when it was done and both children were breathing and warm, Seraphine held one in each arm and looked at them with the particular expression of a person who has just been shown the full scope of what they're dealing with. They had his face. Not entirely. Not the exact architecture, not yet. They were too new for exact architecture. But the bone structure was there already, the suggestion of it, the broad forehead and the strong jaw that would take years to fully emerge but was already present as a sketch beneath the unfinished softness of newborn features. His face on her children, which meant his face would walk through the world for the rest of her life, whether she wanted it to or not. She had made her peace with that before they were born. She had had 9 months to make her peace with it. She looked at them and thought, "You will be nothing like him where it counts. You will know the cost of what you carry. You will know that authority is not the same as right. I will make sure of it." That was the promise she made in the mountain territory in the early spring, with Gula cleaning up in the corner and her mother standing at the window with her arms crossed, and Marin asleep in the chair by the fire because Marin was 61 and had been awake for 22 hours. She kept that promise for 14 years. The territory hardened them the way high altitude hardens everything, gradually, without asking, by the simple fact of its conditions. They learned to ride before they learned to read. They learned to track before they learned arithmetic. The packmaster who'd trained Seraphine with a short sword at 12 got them started at 9, because they were big for their age and because they were already doing things that made the packmaster look at Seraphine with an expression that asked, quietly, where exactly did these children come from? She never answered that directly. What she said when people asked about their father, and people did ask, because a woman raising twins alone in a mountain territory draws that question, eventually, was that he was gone, and that he had made choices she could not stand behind, and that the children were hers. This answer was unsatisfying enough that most people stopped asking after the second time. The ones who didn't stop were the ones with political instincts, and those ones she watched carefully. Kaelin was the elder by 4 minutes and had inherited her precision without her patience. He was the one who finished arguments decisively, who read terrain in the way his grandfather had read court politics. Quickly, with a preference for the least complicated solution that still got the job done. He made friends without effort and kept them with a reliability that people around him came to depend on before they quite realized they were depending on it. Lucien had more of her interior life. He was quieter, more observational, the one who was still watching a situation 20 minutes after Kaelin had already decided what to do about it. He had a particular gift for understanding what people wanted that was separate from what they were saying, a sensitivity to subtext that Seraphine recognized as her own, and that she had learned over the years to consider a form of intelligence rather than a vulnerability. Together they were not complete exactly, that was too simple, but complementary in the way that things which have grown alongside each other sometimes become, where each one's specific capability fills the space the others leaves open. Kaelin moved fast, and Lucien caught what Kaelin missed. Lucien saw the long shape of things, and Kaelin handled the immediate problem. Between them, they covered most of the angles. She had taught them that too. Not explicitly. She didn't teach things explicitly if she could help it. She had a bone-deep aversion to instruction that announced itself as instruction. She taught by setting situations and watching how they responded, and then later, when they were tired and off guard and less invested in performing competence, talking about what she'd observed. This approach meant that by the time they were 12, they had absorbed a working understanding of strategy, resource management, human psychology, and the specific vulnerabilities of power structures without being able to articulate exactly where they'd learned it. That was deliberate. Knowledge you can't locate in a single conversation or a specific lesson is knowledge that becomes native. It stops being information and starts being instinct. An instinct is harder to take from a person than anything learned from a book. She had been building instinct into them for 12 years when the reports from the Capitol started getting bad enough that she could no longer manage them from a distance. The first reports had come through in year 4. Vesper Rowan was consolidating influence over the Eastern Trade Council. Routine, expected, a new Luna establishing her position. Year 6. The grain tariff restructuring that Seraphine had fixed was quietly reversed. The river packs were struggling again. This was the first sign of something more than personal ambition. This was policy that served Vesper's family territories specifically at the cost of the packs that had leased. Year 9. 2 of Theron's senior advisors were replaced in the same month, men who had been in their positions for over a decade, replaced by people whose primary credential appeared to be proximity to Lady Vesper Rowan. Year 11. The border security chief, the man Seraphine had warned Theron about, the one taking bribes, the one he'd eventually removed, was quietly reinstated by a council vote in which Theron's recorded position was abstention. Year 13. The Eastern Grain Alliance collapsed, famine conditions in 3 riverpack territories, a rebel faction forming in the desert basin under the leadership of a wolf named Dram Kalosh, who had lost his pack's trading rights in a tariff dispute that should never have happened if the original accords had remained in place. Seraphine read the Year 13 report on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, sitting at the table in the territory hall with Kaelin across from her doing something with a knife and a piece of cord and Lucien reading a territorial map on the floor. And she put the report down very carefully and sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to look at this." Both of them looked up. Kaelin set down the knife. Lucien came off the floor. She pushed the report across the table. Kaelin read it first. He read faster, skim and extract, and then slid it to Lucien without commentary. And Lucien read it more slowly, and Seraphine watched her sons read a document about a kingdom that did not know they existed, and thought about how many years she'd been watching the water rise and telling herself she would wait for the right moment. 3 river packs in famine conditions, Kaelin said. Yes. And the rebel factions in the desert basin, which means they're blocking the southern trade route. Effectively, yes. Lucien looked up from the report. The Eastern Grain Alliance collapse. That's the same accord you rebuilt in year 6 of your time at court. He said it matter-of-factly, without the particular weight of an accusation, just as a piece of information he was connecting to other pieces. Seraphine had told them the broad outline of the capital years. Not everything, not in detail, but enough that they understood the political landscape and her position in it. She had not told them who their father was. She had said, consistently, that his identity was a matter they would discuss when the time was right, and they had accepted this with the patience of people who have learned that their mother's timing is usually better than theirs. "Yes," she said. Lucien put the report down. He looked at his brother, and something passed between them that Seraphine recognized as the compressed sibling communication of people who have spent 14 years in each other's company. Whole sentences exchanged in a shared glance, positions staked and adjusted without a word. "The kingdom trials are in 6 months, Kaelin said. She looked at him. "I read the territorial circulars," he said without apology. "The Alpha King announced them 8 months ago. Open recruitment. Any wolf in Veilthorn can present at the capital and enter the trials. He's rebuilding the royal guard because he's lost half of them to the rebel faction or retirement." "I know," she said. "It's a way in," Lucien said, "into the capital, into the court structure. Without identification requirements, open recruitment means open recruitment. He needs numbers." "I know what it is," she said. Her sons looked at her. They had his eyes, the exact color of them. That particular gray-dark that was neither quite gray nor quite dark, but something between. A color that had no name in the common tongue, but that she had spent 14 years pretending didn't make her chest do what it did every time she looked at her children. They had his eyes and her jaw, set right now in identical expressions of patient waiting. She looked at her sons and thought about the watchtower and the rainstorm and how wrong she'd been to read that moment as a fixed truth rather than a passing condition. How much it had cost her to confuse the particular focus of a man who wanted her with the loyalty of a man who would choose her. She thought about 3 Riverpack territories in famine conditions. She thought about Dram Kalok's rebel faction blocking the southern trade route, which meant the famine would get worse before it got better, which meant people were dying right now in territories that Theron had failed to protect because he'd been too busy failing to understand what was happening in his own court. She thought about Kaelin and Lucien entering the kingdom trials as ordinary recruits, anonymous, carrying nothing but their own capability, and whether capability was enough to get them close enough to matter. Then she remembered who their father was. Capability was not going to be the problem. The problem was going to be what happened when 14 years of Blackridge bloodline walked into a royal arena and did something that only the royal bloodline could do. And she thought about that specific problem for exactly 4 seconds before she understood that it was not a problem at all. It was the point. "If you go," she said, "you go as who you are. Not Blackridge. You don't use that name. Not yet. Ashvale. You enter as Ashvale recruits from the Northern Territories. Ordinary. Unremarkable." "And when we're not unremarkable?" Kaelin said. She held his gaze. He'd asked the real question. Not if, but when. Because Kaelin Ashvale had grown up in the high country with his mother's precision and his father's alpha capacity, and he was not unrealistic about his own potential, which was a quality she had always both valued and been quietly unnerved by. "When you're not unremarkable," she said, "that becomes a different conversation." Lucien said, "Are you coming with us?" The question had a weight to it that the words alone didn't explain. He was asking something inside the question, not just whether she intended to travel south with them, but whether she was finally going to put herself in the same space as what she'd left 14 years ago, whether she was ready for that specific confrontation. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for years, in the abstract, the way you think about a thing you're not yet ready to plan, and she understood that she was still not quite ready, that she needed them to go first, to be inside the system, before she walked in behind them. Because when Seraphine Ashvale walked back into Veilthorn's capital, it was not going to be quiet. It was not going to be anonymous. And it was not going to happen before her sons were in a position where the court would have to look at them and acknowledge what they were, because she would not put herself in that arena with nothing behind her. She would not walk into that room empty-handed again. "Not yet," she said. She watched Kaelin absorb this. He didn't argue. He understood strategy well enough to understand the sequencing of it. But something moved across his face that she recognized as an older version of an expression she'd seen on him at 6 years old, when he wanted something badly enough that his control over his face wasn't quite complete. He wanted her in that room with them. She wanted to be in that room with them. 6 months, she said. You have 6 months to establish yourselves, to get inside the trial structure, to be seen. Then I'll come. Lucian looked at the map he'd left on the floor. It was a territorial map of Valethorn. She hadn't bought it for him. She'd found it rolled up in his sleeping area 3 months ago and had chosen not to ask. He'd been studying it. He'd been studying it for a while. The capital is a 4-day ride from the Northern Pass entry point, he said. If we leave in the 3rd month, we arrive with 2 weeks before trial registration closes. Yes. We'll need cover identities that are verifiable enough to pass initial screening. Marin will handle the documentation, she said. Marin was 71 now and had slowed in her body but not in any other respect, and she maintained a correspondence network in 6 territories that she had never once described to Seraphine in any detail, which Seraphine had always taken as a sign of professional excellence. Kalen leaned back in his chair. He was looking at her with the particular expression he got when he was holding something back. Not deceptive. She'd raised him too honest for deception, but careful. You should know, he said, whatever we see down there, whatever he's become, it's not going to change. He stopped. Finish it, she said. It's not going to change what you built here, he said. What you gave us. That's ours. He doesn't get to... Another stop. He had her precision, and sometimes her precision didn't have enough room for what he was actually trying to say. Lucian finished it for him, the way Lucian always finished the things Kalen started and ran out of language for. We're not going down there to fix what he broke, Lucienne said. We're going down there because 3 river packs are starving and someone has to. Seraphine looked at her sons, 14 years of mountain mornings, 14 years of hard riding and harder conversations and the kind of quiet, consistent modeling of what it looks like to keep going when the terrain is against you. 14 years of building something in the cold, in the altitude, in the place where the man who'd discarded her couldn't reach, couldn't influence, couldn't reduce. She had built this. These two. The specific combination of capability and judgment and the bone-deep understanding that power exists to serve the people who need it, not the person who holds it. She had built this out of what he'd taken from her, and she would not cry about it, and she would not be grateful to him for it, and she would not pretend the cost of it was anything other than what it was. But she would send it south. She would send it into the kingdom that had rejected her, and she would watch from a distance as the things she'd built did what things built correctly always do. It would find the cracks in the structure that had failed, and it would hold the weight that the existing structure couldn't carry, and eventually the people in that court would understand that what they were looking at was not a surprise. It was a consequence. Go pack, she said, both of you. Light, riding gear, and weapons, nothing that marks you as Northern Territory. You leave at first light. They stood. Kalen was already at the door when he turned back, and the look on his face was the one she'd never found a name for. It was the look that meant he was seeing her clearly, all the way through, the way very few people ever managed to see another person, and that being seen by it was both the hardest and the best thing she knew. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She sat alone in the territory hall after they'd gone to their rooms, and the fire burned low and the autumn dark pressed against the windows, and she thought about Valethorn's capital 4 days south of the Northern Pass, and the kingdom trials 6 months away, and the Silver Mark Arch under its 300 torches, and the particular moment when a moonstone crown settles onto hair that isn't yours. She thought about what it would feel like to walk back into that city. She thought about it for a long time, and then she heard something that stopped every thought in her head. A sound outside the territory hall door, a horse arriving fast from the direction of the eastern road, faster than any normal courier would push a horse on a cold autumn night. And she was at the door before she'd consciously decided to move, her body running its own calculations separate from her mind, and when she pulled the door open, the rider was already dismounting, already coming toward her, already holding out a sealed document with a territorial mark she recognized as Cordon Ashby's private courier seal. She took the document. She broke the seal. The message inside was 9 words. She read them once. She read them again. 9 words, and the entire sequencing she'd laid out an hour ago. The 6 months, the trials, the careful establishment, the plan she'd been building in her mind for years, collapsed. Because 9 words from Corden Ashby, who had never once in 14 years made contact with her, meant that whatever was happening in Valethorn's capital was not 6 months away. It was now. 9 words. Seraphine read them a third time in the torchlight of the Territory Hall doorway, and the cold coming off the autumn dark was very specific against her face. The kind of cold that makes you aware of your own skin, your own temperature, the thin biological barrier between what you are and what the world outside will do to you without it. They know there are heirs. Vesper moves at the next full moon. The next full moon was 11 days away. She looked up at the courier, a young wolf, hard-ridden, his horse blowing steam in the dark behind him, his face carrying the particular blank exhaustion of someone who has pushed past the point where fatigue has texture and arrived somewhere flatter and more absolute. "How long did you ride?" she said. 4 days, he said. Lord Ashby said not to stop. 4 days meant Corden had sent this the moment he had the information. 4 days meant he'd been sitting on this information for 0 days before sending it, which meant he considered it urgent enough that 0 days was the correct interval, which meant whatever Vesper Rowan was moving toward at the next full moon was not a political maneuver. It was an ending. She gave the courier to the Territory Hall's night staff with instructions about food and a bed and the horse, and she went inside and stood at the fire with the 9 words in her hand, and thought with the cold mechanical clarity that activated in her when the situation removed the option of feeling things in real time. Vesper knew about the heirs. The specific shape of this information, not suspects, not rumors, knows, meant a source, a real one. Someone with access to information that had been held inside a very small circle for 14 years. Herself, Marin, her mother, Gula, and the packmaster who had trained the boys, and who had never asked the question he clearly already knew the answer to. 5 people. Seraphine trusted all 5 of them with the unexamined confidence that comes from 14 years of demonstrated loyalty, which meant one of 5 people she trusted completely had either broken or been broken. She did not let herself stand with that thought longer than necessary. She filed it in the category of things she would examine thoroughly once the immediate problem was handled, because a person who stops to grieve a betrayal in the middle of the crisis. The betrayal created is a person who loses both the grief and the crisis. She went to Kalen's room first. He was awake. She didn't know if he'd heard the horse or if he simply hadn't been asleep, the way he sometimes wasn't, lying in the dark running scenarios, the way she ran scenarios. A quality she'd noticed in him at age 9 and recognized with the specific discomfort of watching yourself in miniature. "Get up," she said from the doorway. "Get Lucien." He didn't ask why. He was pulling his boots on before she finished the sentence. They met in the Territory Hall 3 minutes later, both of them sleep-rough and clear-eyed. The particular alertness of young wolves whose nervous systems have been calibrated by years of early mornings and physical training to move from rest to readiness without the gradual warm-up that softer lives require. She put the 9 words on the table between them. Kalen read it. His jaw set. Lucien read it. His face went very still, which was worse. "How?" Kalen said. "I don't know yet." "The full moon is 11 days." Lucien looked up from the paper. "She's not just moving against us," he said. "If she knows there are heirs and she's moving at the moon, she's moving against the throne. She needs to eliminate us before we can be legitimized, which means she's already positioned herself to control the succession." He was right. Seraphine had reached the same conclusion 3 minutes ago in the doorway. Vesper didn't just want them dead. She wanted them dead in a specific window, before the Kingdom trials, before any public arena where 2 young wolves with the Blackridge bloodline could demonstrate what they were in front of witnesses that Vesper couldn't control. After the trials, it would be too late for erasure. The court would have already seen them. The packs would already know. Before the trials, with 11 days and the full moon as cover, a disappearance could be made to look like anything. "We can't wait for the trials," Seraphine said. "We have to go now," Kalen said. It wasn't a question. "We have to go now," she confirmed. "All 3 of us. We leave before dawn." The silence that followed was brief and had a specific quality, the quality of a plan that has just been fundamentally restructured under pressure, and everyone in the room understanding that the restructured version carries risks the original didn't, and no one having a better option. "She'll have people watching the roads," Lucian said. "Yes." "Southern route will be monitored. Eastern has the rebel faction's territory to navigate." "We take the Western Mountain Road," Seraphine said. "It's slower, it's harder. It comes out 40 miles north of the capital through the Greywood border, and it's not a road anyone uses in autumn because the upper section is barely passable after the first frost." "You've ridden it," Kaelin said. "Once. 14 years ago, going the other direction." She watched her sons look at each other again, that compressed communication, and then Kaelin said, 3 days? 4, on that road in this season. Maybe 3.5 if the frost hasn't hit the upper section yet. That leaves us 7 days before the full moon. To get into the capital, establish ourselves, and be somewhere public enough that making us disappear creates more problems than leaving us alive. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it leaves us." She went to pack. She had an hour before dawn and she used 50 minutes of it efficiently and spent the remaining 10 standing in her room, looking at the small collection of things she'd built a life around in this territory. The territorial maps, the correspondence files, the short sword on the wall that was not her mother's and not her own, but had belonged to a woman she'd trained under briefly at 19, who had told her that the difference between a weapon and a tool was entirely a matter of intent. She took the sword. She left the maps. She left everything that was heavy and took everything that was necessary, which in 14 years of mountain living she'd learned to keep to a very short list. Marin was in the stable when she got there, saddling the mountain horses with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been anticipating this moment since the courier arrived. She didn't ask for an explanation. She listened to Seraphine's compressed summary of the situation, adjusted the girth on the second horse, and said, "The Western Mountain Road has a way station at the halfway point. I have a contact there." "Of course you do," Seraphine said. They rode out in the last full dark before dawn, 4 of them, Seraphine, Kaelin, Lucian, Marin, through the territory's northern gate and onto the mountain road with the cold coming down hard from the altitude above, and the territory behind them going dark as they moved away from its lights. And Seraphine did not look back this time either, but for a different reason than the last time. The last time she'd been leaving something that had been taken from her. This time, she was leaving something she'd built. And the difference between those two things lived in her chest as a different weight. Heavier in some ways, cleaner in others. The weight of choosing to go rather than being forced. The Western Mountain Road earned its reputation over the first 12 hours. It climbed in switchbacks that required the horses to work at a controlled pace, no pushing, because a horse that stumbles on a switchback at altitude is a horse, and a rider you don't recover. And the first frost had hit the upper section just barely, the ground giving under hooves with a soft crunch that meant ice under the soil, the particular treachery of ground that looks solid and isn't. They didn't talk much. The road required attention, and the attention required quiet, and all 4 of them were the kind of people who understood that silence is not absence. It's a different form of presence, the form that conserves what you need for later. Seraphine rode at the front and let the road take her full concentration, which meant she couldn't think about Cordon's message, or Vesper's 11 days, or the question of the source, the 5 people, the circle that had held for 14 years and was now broken somewhere she couldn't yet see. She was grateful for the road's demands. She had always been good at using hard physical conditions to manage the things her mind would otherwise fixate on to no useful purpose. By the second night, camped in the partial shelter of a rock overhang with the horses close and the fire built small and low, Lucienne said what none of them had said yet. Someone told her. "Yes," Seraphine said. "Not grandmother, not Gula, not Marin." He wasn't asking her to confirm those eliminations. He was doing the mathematics out loud, the way Lucian did his thinking, externally, step by step, each premise stated before the next was built on it. "That leaves the packmaster," Kaelin said. Seraphine had her eyes on the fire. "Or someone the packmaster told." "Aldrich wouldn't," Kaelin started. "He might not have known he was telling," she said. "Vesper has resources. She has 14 years of practicing the extraction of information from people who don't realize they're being extracted from. A conversation in a way station, a question that seems innocent, an answer that seems unimportant. She paused. Aldrich is loyal. That doesn't mean he's untouchable. The fire snapped in the silence. Kaylin stared at it with the expression of someone revising a foundational assumption, which was a specific kind of discomfort that you either learned to tolerate or it broke you. And she watched her son work through it and arrive at the other side with his jaw set and his eyes clear, and she thought, good. That's the right landing. It doesn't matter now, Lucien said. What matters is what she's planning to do with the information. Elimination, Kaylin said flatly. That's what moving at the moon means. Not exposure, not political maneuvering. She wants us gone before the trials because after the trials, we're too visible. She'd need the king's authorization for anything official, Lucien said, which means either she has it or she's planning something that doesn't require it. Seraphine had been thinking about this for 2 days. She had turned it over from every angle she could find, and she kept arriving at the same place. The place she didn't want to arrive at, because it required her to think about Theron in a specific way that she had spent 14 years not thinking about him. She doesn't have the king's authorization, she said. Both of them looked at her. If she had it, she'd have moved faster. 11 days to the moon is enough time for an authorized action to be carried out in 2. She's working around him, not through him. Which means he doesn't know about us, Lucien said slowly. He doesn't know about you, she said. No, I don't believe he does. The fire. The cold coming down from the altitude. The horses shifting in their temporary shelter. Kaylin said, Does that matter? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things, even when honest thinking produced answers she didn't want. It matters for the strategy, she said. It doesn't matter for anything else. He accepted this. He was 14 years old, and he had his mother's precision, and he understood, she thought, more about what she meant by that distinction than she'd ever explicitly taught him, which meant she'd modeled it clearly enough that it had become part of his native understanding of how the world worked. It doesn't matter for anything else. The western road brought them out of the mountains on the 4th morning, cold and stiff and trail filthy, onto the broad, flat approach to the gray wood border that she hadn't seen in 14 years. The trees were the same, old growth, dense, the kind of forest that predates the kingdom's current political arrangements by several centuries, and will outlast the next several as well, indifferent to what humans do inside it. She had ridden through this forest with Theron once, during the border skirmish in her 3rd year at court. She remembered the quality of light in it, how it came through the canopy in specific shafts, how it moved with the wind in the upper branches while the forest floors stayed relatively still, a disconnection between what was happening above and what was happening below that she had found, at the time, aesthetically interesting. She did not find it interesting now. She rode through it with her eyes on the road and her mind on the capital 40 miles ahead and the 7 days remaining before the full moon, and she did not allow herself the indulgence of looking for things she remembered. They were 2 miles from the capital's outer boundary when the riders came out of the tree line. 6 of them. No insignia, deliberately no insignia, which told her more than insignia would have. Vesper's people operated without marks when operating without authorization. Kaylin had them before she did. He'd been riding with his eyes on the tree line for the past hour, which told her he'd been thinking about this contingency with more specificity than she had, and she filed that observation in the part of her mind that tracked her son's capabilities, because it mattered and she would think about it later. 6, he said very quietly. I see them. Lucien had already shifted his weight on his horse, a subtle adjustment that meant his right hand was a half second from his weapon rather than a full second. He looked relaxed. He wasn't. The lead rider came forward and stopped his horse 15 feet from them. He was a large wolf, broad in the chest, the kind of size that gets used to doing work that doesn't require conversation. His face was professionally blank in the way that faces are blank when the person wearing them has been told to collect, not to harm, yet and is waiting for the instruction to change. Seraphine Ashvale, he said. Not a question. You have the wrong road, she said. Lady Vesper requests your presence at the capital. still professionally blank. All three of you. She felt both her sons go very still beside her in the way that people go still when they are not standing down but gathering, the particular stillness that precedes movement rather than following it. Lady Vesper, she said, holds no authority over my travel. That's a matter of some debate, the man said. Currently. There is no debate, Kaelin said. His voice was level and had an edge to it that she recognized as new. Not something she'd heard from him before, not quite. Something that came from the specific circumstance of being 20 feet from the first person who'd ever actually threatened him, and discovering that his reaction to it was not fear, but something colder and more focused than fear. Step off the road. The man looked at Kaelin. Something moved across his face. A recalibration, the kind that happens when the thing in front of you turns out to be larger than you measured it. The boys come too, he said to Seraphine. That's not optional. What happened next was fast. Not chaotic, fast. Kaelin moved first because Kaelin always moved first. But the move was not impulsive. It was the product of a brain that had already run the geometry of 6 opponents and 4 defenders and the specific positions of all 10 bodies on this road, and had identified the sequence that changed those odds most efficiently before the man on the lead horse finished his sentence. He came off his horse before the man fully processed that he was moving, and the 2 lead riders were on the ground before the remaining 4 understood that the engagement had started. Lucian was already positioned when Kaelin moved, had positioned himself during Kaelin's conversation, using the conversation as cover, which was something they'd developed together over years of training without anyone teaching it to them specifically. The organic cooperation of 2 minds that understood each other's timing. Seraphine was off her horse and had the short sword in her hand, and the remaining 4 riders were dealing with the fact that what they'd been sent to collect had reorganized the situation entirely in approximately 4 seconds, and that the 2 young wolves currently between them and their objective were operating at a level that did not match the profile they'd been given. It was over in under a minute. No deaths. She'd signaled Kaelin to take them down without killing, because dead bodies on the Greywood Road were a different set of problems than unconscious ones, and her sons were capable of the distinction. All 6 riders were on the ground, alive, in varying states of incapacitation. In the silence after, with the horses blowing hard and the forest completely still around them, Kaelin stood in the road with his chest rising and falling and his face wearing an expression she had never seen on him before. Not triumph, not adrenaline, something quieter and more permanent. The expression of a person who has just learned something about themselves that they will not be able to unknow, something about what they are capable of and what that capability means, and who is in the first moment of understanding that this knowledge will change everything about how they move through the world from this point forward. Lucian was looking at her. They knew where we'd come out, he said. The Western Road, the specific exit point. She met his eyes. The contact at the way station, he said. Marin, behind her, said nothing. Seraphine turned and looked at Marin, and Marin's face was the face of someone who has just understood something that is costing them more than they budgeted for. Marin, Seraphine said. My contact at the way station is an old man named Paris, Marin said. Her voice was steady, and her face was the face of someone standing in the specific fire of a thing they did not intend. He's worked that way station for 30 years. He has a granddaughter in the capital. I did not know that Vesper's people had leverage on him. I did not know that me making contact would signal our route. A pause that had considerable weight in it. I did not know. The forest around them was silent in the way old forests are silent, comprehensively, with a depth that city silences never achieve. Seraphine looked at Marin for a long moment. 71 years old, iron gray and steady, who had packed 4 horses in a cold stable and ridden 3.5 days on a mountain road because there was no version of this situation in which she would have done otherwise. I know you didn't, Seraphine said. And that was true. She knew it completely. But it didn't change the fact that Vesper's network had just demonstrated a reach she had underestimated, and that the underestimation had cost her the careful, quiet entry into the capital that the entire plan had depended on. She looked down at the 6 unconscious men on the road. She looked at the capital, 40 miles ahead. She looked at her sons. Kaelin with his new expression, and Lucien with his careful eyes. And she understood, standing on that road in the forest that had outlasted every kingdom built around it, that the version of this she'd planned was gone. The quiet entry, the established cover, the careful positioning, gone. Vesper knew they were coming. Vesper knew what road they'd taken. Vesper had 7 days and the resources of a Luna's court, and the specific advantage of knowing that what was coming toward her capital was something that could not be stopped by 6 riders, which meant she would send more, which meant the only path into the capital that had any chance of working now was not quiet. It was loud. It was the kingdom trials, immediate registration, public arena, in front of every witness that Vesper couldn't silence. And it was walking into that arena not as unremarkable northern recruits, but as exactly what they were, with their mother behind them, and the documentation that Seraphine had been carrying in the sealed leather case for 14 years. The documentation that Gula had signed and her mother had witnessed, and Marin had kept in perfect legal order across every year and every territory change, because Marin understood that some documents needed to exist in the world with the same permanence as the facts they recorded. Birth records, bloodline attestations, the sealed correspondence from Cordon Ashby, kept over 14 years with the care of a woman who understood that truth is only power when it can be proven. She had not planned to use them this way. She had planned to use them at a moment of her choosing, in a context she controlled with the sequencing she'd designed. She had 7 days and no sequencing and a Luna who was already moving. Sometimes the plan is a luxury and the situation is what you have. "We ride tonight," she said, "all 4 of us. We don't stop in the capital before the trial grounds. We go directly to the registration gate and we put our names on the list before anyone in Vesper's network can close it." She looked at Kaylin, who was looking at her with the focused clarity of someone whose capabilities have just been confirmed to them in the most direct way possible. "You and Lucien register as Ashvale recruits from the Northern Territories, exactly as we planned." "And you," Lucien said. She picked up her sword from the ground where she'd set it and slid it back into the scabbard. "I register as what I am," she said. Both of them went very still. "What you—" Kaylin stopped, started again. "What does that mean?" She looked at her sons, his eyes in her children's faces, looking at her across 14 years of mountain mornings and hard conversations and the careful daily rebuilding of a person out of the materials a betrayal leaves behind. "It means," she said, "that when we walk through that gate, the kingdom is going to know your mother's name." The forest was silent. The capital was 40 miles away, and somewhere inside it, in the court she'd spent 14 years staying out of, Vesper Rowan was moving toward a full moon deadline with the confidence of a woman who believed she had already won, not knowing that the thing she'd spent 11 days trying to stop had just abandoned every quiet strategy, every careful approach, every plan that kept it manageable. Not knowing that what was coming toward her now had nothing left to lose in 14 years of reasons. They rode through the night without stopping, 40 miles on bad roads in cold dark, and Seraphine set the pace from the front, not reckless, not the frantic gallop of people running from something, but the hard, sustained drive of people moving toward something with full knowledge of what they're moving toward, and the decision already made and settled in the body where decisions live when they stop being thoughts and become commitments. The mountain horses were built for exactly this. They ate the miles with the deep-chested patience of animals that understand difficult terrain as their native condition. Nobody talked. There was nothing left to plan that hadn't been planned, and the rest of it, the variables, the timing, the specific shape of what waited at the other end of 40 miles, would not be improved by conversation. Seraphine rode with the sealed leather case across her back and 14 years of accumulated precision in her chest, and thought about nothing she could afford to think about. She had long since learned to manage herself the way you manage a fire in high wind, not by trying to control what the wind does, but by knowing exactly how much fuel you have and tending it with absolute attention. She had enough fuel. She would get to the other end. The capital's outer boundary appeared in the gray pre-dawn as a change in the road's quality first, the packed earth giving way to the broad stone-paved approach that the eastern and western trade routes converged on before the city gates. She had ridden this approach before. She had ridden it in the other direction 14 years ago in the third hour of a cold night, with Marin beside her and the sound of ceremony drums following her out of the city and the specific weight of a decision settling into her bones. Coming back felt nothing like leaving had felt. Leaving had been survival. Coming back was something that didn't have a clean name. Not revenge, not vindication, not justice exactly, though justice was part of it. It was closer to completion. The closing of a circuit that had been open for 14 years, carrying a charge that had nowhere to go. The city gates opened at first light for trade traffic, and they joined the stream of carts and merchants and territorial representatives arriving for the kingdom trials without drawing specific attention. 4 road-dirty travelers on mountain horses, tired in the way that people are tired when they have been riding all night, unremarkable in every visible detail. The trial registration gate was on the palace's eastern approach, a secondary entrance that had been opened specifically for the event, and there was already a line at it despite the early hour. Young wolves from territories across Valethorn, some with the marks of formal pack training and some without, all of them here for the same reason, the Alpha King's open call, the promise of a place in the royal guard for anyone who could prove themselves in the arena. Seraphine looked at that line and thought about Vesper Rowan, who was somewhere inside the palace walls right now, who had sent 6 riders to a forest road last night and would know by now that those 6 riders had not completed their assignment. She thought about how much time they had before Vesper's next move arrived. Not much. "Kaelin," she said quietly. "Lucien, go register. Ashvale recruits, Northern Territories, exactly as we discussed." "And you," Kaelin said. Same question as the forest road asked again because the situation now was more specific than it had been then. "I'll be at the registration gate in 10 minutes, she said. "I need to speak with someone first." She looked at Marin. Marin understood immediately, which was the consistent quality of Marin's intelligence. She didn't need the sentence completed, she just needed the first half and the context was 14 years deep. "The Eastern Archive," Marin said. "Corden maintains a secondary office there." "Yes?" Marin dismounted and handed her reins to Lucien without being asked. "I'll go with you." "No," Seraphine said. "Stay with the boys until I get to the gate. I need eyes on them that aren't mine." Marin looked at her for a moment with the expression she got when she disagreed with a decision but understood the reasoning and was choosing to trust it. Then she nodded and turned toward the registration line, and Seraphine watched her sons follow. Kaelin with his long stride and his new expression, Lucien reading the crowd the way he read everything, systematically. And then she turned her horse toward the Eastern Archive. Corden Ashby's secondary office was not a thing that appeared on any official map of the palace complex. It was a room behind a record storage alcove that had been classified as disused for 11 years. And Seraphine knew about it because Corden had shown it to her in her 3rd year at court, when they had developed the specific kind of professional relationship that exists between 2 people who are both, in different ways, in the business of knowing things that other people don't. He was there. She had not sent word that she was coming. She didn't need to. He had sent the message 9 words long 4 days ago with 0 days of sitting on the information, which meant he had already understood that she would come, and that she would come fast, and that the place she would come to was here. He looked older. 14 years was 14 years, and Corden Ashby had spent those years in a court that had been getting harder by degrees, and it showed in the way that years of sustained stress show. Not in dramatic aging, but in the removal of a certain quality of ease that doesn't come back once it goes. "You made it," he said. "You doubted it." "No." He looked at her with the direct assessment of a man whose professional survival has depended for decades on accurate evaluation of the people in front of him. "I didn't doubt it." She sat across from him in the small cold room with its single lamp and its stacked records boxes and said, "Tell me everything," he told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was worse than the 9 words had suggested, which she had known it would be because 9 words are a compression, and compressions always lose resolution. Vesper's network had been building for 8 years, not the 3 or 4 years that Seraphine had estimated from the policy shifts she'd tracked in the territorial reports, but 8, which meant Vesper had begun the consolidation of her parallel power structure almost immediately after the Luna ceremony, which meant the Luna ceremony had not been the culmination of something, but the beginning. She had replaced advisors systematically, not just the ones with proximity to the king, but the ones with proximity to the kingdom's administrative function, the territorial tax assessors, the pack liaison officers, the border security chief. She had seated her own people into positions that looked administrative and were actually structural, the way you take a building not by attacking the walls, but by replacing the foundations beneath them. Theron had not seen it. Or, Corden paused here, with the careful phrasing of a loyal man distinguishing between what he knew and what he believed. Theron had not allowed himself to see it, which was a different problem and in some ways a worse one. He's isolated, Corden said. Not physically. He moves freely. He holds counsel. He carries out his functions. But his information is filtered. The people who would tell him true things, the people like you were for him, they're either gone or they've learned not to. He paused. He's a king who no longer knows what his kingdom looks like. The assassination attempt during the trials, Seraphine said. Is that Vesper's move at the full moon? Corden's face confirmed it before he said anything. We believe so, he said. Not the king directly. Vesper doesn't want Theron dead. She wants him controlled, and a dead king creates succession problems she hasn't fully solved. But an assassination attempt creates chaos, and chaos creates the conditions for emergency authority to be transferred. He looked at her. To the Luna, pending succession resolution. Pending succession resolution. Pending the elimination of 2 heirs who were currently standing in the registration line at the eastern gate. She stood up. Corden, she said, the trials begin this morning. The first elimination round is at midday. I need you in that arena, she said, with everything you have. Whatever documentation, whatever testimony, whatever witnesses you've managed to maintain over 8 years of working inside her network, I need it in that arena today, before the first elimination round ends. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man calculating not probability but cost, his own specific cost, the thing he would be putting down on the table when he walked into that arena with 14 years of evidence against the woman currently occupying the Luna's seat. This ends my career, he said. Your career ended the moment you sent that message, she said. Not unkind, true. You knew it when you sent it. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Yes, he said. I did. She was at the registration gate in 7 minutes. The line had moved. Kaylin and Lucien were through it. She could see them at the far end of the registration yard, in the holding area for accepted recruits, and they were already drawing attention without appearing to try. This was something she had predicted and dreaded and known was inevitable, and seeing it arrive in practice was no easier for having predicted it. They were simply visible. Not loudly, not performatively, but with the particular quality of people who generate gravity, who make the ambient eye track toward them without consciously deciding to, the way tall structures draw the gaze in landscapes that would otherwise be flat. She went to the registration table. The officer behind it looked up from his ledger with the professional blankness of someone who has been processing recruits for 6 hours and is running on efficiency rather than engagement. Name, he said. Seraphine Ashvale, she said. Former counsel to the Alpha King of Valethorn. I am registering not as a trial recruit but as a petitioner for immediate court audience, under the open trials provision that requires the king's presence in the arena for the elimination rounds. The officer's blankness developed a crack in it. That provision is for trial disputes and formal challenges, he said carefully. I have a formal challenge, she said. She put the leather case on the table and opened it and put the first document in front of him. Not all of them, just the top one, which was the birth attestation signed by Gula and witnessed by Alara Ashvale and dated 14 years and 3 months ago, recording the birth of 2 male children to Seraphine Ashvale, their lineage recorded in the traditional form that the Northern Territories had used for 300 years and that was legally binding in every pack court in Valethorn. The officer looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked back at the document. I'll need to, he started. Get your supervisor, she said. Yes, do that. The arena at midday held 3,000 spectators, territorial representatives, pack elders, court officials, and the general population of wolves who had the standing to attend kingdom trials, which in Valethorn's system was broad enough to include most of the capital's resident population in the upper tiers. The trials themselves were conducted on the floor of the arena, a space Seraphine recognized with the specific clarity of places you have visited in dreams so many times that walking into them in waking life produces a dissociation, a doubling, the real place and the imagined place occupying the same space simultaneously. She was in the third-tier corridor when the first elimination round began, working her way toward the official observers section with Corden behind her and two of his people, a records keeper and a former border chief who had lost her position 18 months ago in one of Vesper's administrative reassignments, and the leather case with its 14 years of documentation. She could see the arena floor. She could see Kaelin and Lucian in the first group of recruits. And she could see, in the Royal Observation Gallery above the arena's north end, Theron Blackridge sitting in the Alpha King's chair with the crown that had been his father's on his head, and the face that she had spent 14 years not thinking about, and failing periodically completely, wearing the particular closed-down expression of a man who has learned to be present in his own spaces without actually inhabiting them. Beside him, in the Luna's chair, Vesper Rowan. Vesper's face, from this distance, told Seraphine everything she needed to know about the morning's intelligence. Vesper knew the 6 riders hadn't completed their assignment. Vesper knew Seraphine was in the capital. And Vesper was managing this knowledge with the professional composure of a woman who had contingency plans. Because a woman who had spent 8 years building a parallel power structure in the court of a king who wasn't paying attention always had contingency plans. The first elimination round started. It was a combat assessment, paired recruits, weapons of their choice, the objective being to demonstrate control and capability without serious injury, the judges scoring on technique and decision-making rather than pure dominance. Seraphine had been involved in designing this format in the early years of her time at court, when Theron had asked her to overhaul the trial structure because the previous version was producing guards who were strong and undisciplined. She watched the first 2 pairs go through their assessments with the detached eye of someone who knows the rubric, and then the third pair was called, and one of the names was Kaelin Ashvale. She watched her son walk to the center of the arena floor. He was taller than she'd been seeing him, or the space made him look at, the arena's scale providing a reference that the mountain territory hadn't. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never spent significant time worrying about the impression he makes, because his entire life has been spent in places where impression is irrelevant and outcome is everything. He picked up the short sword from the weapons rack without examining it, an instinctive assessment by hand rather than eye, the way people handle tools they understand in their bodies. His opponent was a recruit from the Eastern Territories, taller and heavier, with the formal pack training marks on his wrist that indicated years of structured instruction. He was good. Seraphine could assess it from the third tier, the way he held his weight, the economy of his warm-up movement. Kaelin was better. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, not in the first 30 seconds when they were feeling each other out and the crowd's attention was still distributed across the arena. But in the second 30 seconds, when the Eastern recruit committed to a combination and Kaelin read it 2 moves before it completed and was already repositioned when the third move arrived, there was a shift in the quality of attention in the arena. Not a sound? Not yet. Just a shift. Corden had come up beside her in the corridor. "The round ends in 4 minutes," he said quietly. "If we're going to move, it needs to be before the round ends. Once the judges deliver scores, there's a transition period where the crowd disperses and reconvenes. We lose the assembly." "I know," she said. She was watching Theron in the royal gallery. He had leaned forward slightly. Just slightly, the compressed attention of a man whose eye had been caught by something on the arena floor without him quite knowing yet what it was. He was watching Kaelin with the particular focus of someone whose instincts are telling them something that his conscious mind hasn't caught up to. She understood why. She had watched it happen every time either of her sons did something in public in the mountain territory. The way people's eyes tracked them with a recognition that predated information, the animal-level response of wolves to the specific quality of alpha bloodline, not the rank, but the genetic reality of it, the thing in the marrow that speaks a language that doesn't require words. Theron had been an alpha king for 20 years, and he had the bloodline himself, and he would recognize it in his sons before he recognized anything else about them, and he would have no context for the recognition, and that combination, recognition without context, was the most destabilizing thing she could introduce into his current state, which was already, according to Corden, the state of a man who had been surviving on managed isolation for years. She looked at Vesper. Vesper was not watching the arena floor. Vesper was watching the corridor entrances. She was looking for something, or someone, and her composure, from this distance, had developed the particular quality of composure that is performed rather than felt, held in place by will rather than genuine ease, the way a structure holds when you've removed one of its supports, but haven't removed them all yet. She was looking for Seraphine. Seraphine stepped out of the corridor and into the open observers section. The movement was not dramatic. She didn't make it dramatic. She simply stopped not being visible and started being visible. In the third tier of the arena, in the plain riding clothes she'd been wearing for 4 days, and the leather case across her back, and 14 years of absolutely refusing to disappear completely on her face. Vesper found her in under 10 seconds. The quality of Vesper's composure changed. Not collapse. Vesper was too skilled for collapse. But a tightening, a compression, the specific face of a person who has been managing a situation and just discovered that the situation has grown a dimension they didn't account for. On the arena floor, the combat round was entering its final minute. Kaylin and the Eastern recruit were still moving, but the crowd's attention had consolidated now, because what was happening on the floor had stopped being a competent demonstration and had become something else. The recruit was good and was being made to look limited, not through aggression, but through the simple mechanical fact of fighting someone who was reading him 2 moves ahead and had been for the past 2 minutes. And the crowd knew it, and the judges knew it. And in the royal gallery, Theron Blackridge had leaned forward far enough that his forearms were on his knees, and his crown was slightly askew, and he was not thinking about crowns right now. Seraphine moved toward the official observers section with Corden and his people behind her. She had covered 15 feet when Vesper's people appeared at the section entrance. 4 of them, in the plain clothes of court functionaries, which they might have been or might not have been. It was the kind of ambiguity that Vesper's network had been cultivated to produce. They positioned themselves across the access point without being physically obvious about it, the bureaucratic blocking of a corridor that would look, to a casual observer, like standard crowd management. She stopped. Corden behind her said very quietly, "There are 2 more at the eastern entrance." 6. The same number as the forest road. Vesper's preference, or the size of the unit she ran. She looked at the access point. She looked at the arena floor where Kaylin was finishing his round with the clean, efficient closure of someone who has been managing the outcome since before it was obvious that there was an outcome to manage. She looked at the royal gallery, where Theron was now very still in his chair, with the stillness of a man whose instincts have finally produced a coherent message that his mind is in the process of refusing. She had the documentation. She had Corden and his evidence. She had her sons on the arena floor with their bloodline doing exactly what bloodline does when it's put in a situation that requires it to reveal itself. What she did not have was a clear path through 6 functionaries to the observers section and the official challenge protocol that would get her in front of the court with full procedural protection. The combat round ended. The arena's attention shifted to the judges. 3 seconds of recalibration in the crowd, the rustle of 3,000 people redirecting their focus. Kaylin stood in the center of the arena floor and looked up. He looked up before she moved, before she did anything. He scanned the tiers with the systematic eye of someone checking terrain, and he found her in the 3rd tier with the efficiency of someone who has been tracking their mother's location instinctively since approximately age 2, and their eyes met across the distance of the arena. She gave him nothing with her face. He read everything anyway. He turned and said something to Lucian, who was at the edge of the arena floor waiting his turn, and Lucian looked up and found her, and then looked at the official observers section entrance, and found the 4 functionaries, and then looked back at Kaylin, and something passed between them that was not a conversation. Then Kaylin walked to the center of the arena floor and raised his voice in the formal challenge call, the ancient protocol, older than the current dynasty, that any wolf present in a kingdom trials arena had the right to invoke in the presence of the Alpha King. "I call witness," he said. "Under the open trials right, I call the Alpha King to hear evidence before this assembly." The arena went quiet. Not the polite quiet of paused entertainment, the specific silence of 3,000 wolves who have just heard something that activates a protocol that none of them have seen invoked in living memory, and who are in the first moment of understanding that what they came to watch is not what they are going to see. In the royal gallery, Theron stood up. Vesper's hand went to his arm. He looked at her hand. He looked at her. And then he looked at the arena floor, at the young wolf who had just invoked a right that Vesper could not procedurally block without violating the open trials charter that Theron himself had issued 8 months ago. And something in Theron's face did what faces do when a person is confronted with information that they have been successfully prevented from receiving for a long time. It went through a rapid sequence of adjustments, too fast to read individually, and came out the other side as something that looked, from a distance, like a man waking up. Seraphine moved. Not through the access point, around it, using the 3 seconds of the arena's redirected attention and the disruption of Kaelin's challenge call to move laterally along the tier to the secondary access that the functionaries hadn't covered because they'd been deployed to cover the primary one, and she was through it before they reconfigured, with Corden and his people close behind her. She was at the official's floor level, 20 feet from the arena entrance, when the 4 functionaries reached her. The one in front was the large one from the Forest Road. Different clothes, same face, the blank professional efficiency of someone who has been reassigned from last night's failed mission to this morning's follow-up with no visible acknowledgement that last night's mission failed. "Lady Ashvale, he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "Lady Vesper does not have authority over this proceeding," Corden said from behind her, with the flat precision of a man who spent 40 years in court, intelligence, and knows exactly which words in exactly which order close which doors. The open trials challenge protocol supersedes administrative authority. Any interference with a witness responding to a formal challenge call is a violation of the Alpha King's direct charter. Stand down. The man looked at Corden. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the leather case on her back. She watched him calculate, the same calculation that the lead rider in the forest had made, the assessment of the thing in front of him against the instructions he'd been given, trying to determine if his instructions covered this specific situation or if he was in a gap that his principal hadn't briefed him for. Vesper had sent him to stop Seraphine Ashvale from reaching the court. She had not, apparently, briefed him on what to do if Corden Ashby was standing beside her invoking the Open Trials Charter with the specific legal precision of a man who had spent 40 years knowing exactly which arguments could not be countered without creating worse problems than the one you were trying to solve. There was a long second. Then the man stepped aside. Not smoothly. With the specific reluctance of someone making a decision they know is going to have consequences, making it anyway because the alternative consequences are worse. He stepped aside and his people stepped aside, and Seraphine walked through the gap with the leather case and 14 years and Corden behind her, and she did not run. She had spent 14 years not running. She walked out of the access corridor and onto the arena floor. 3,000 wolves. The noise of them. Not quite silence anymore. Not with Kaelin's challenge still hanging in the arena's acoustic memory, but something that was nearly silence, a held breath that had a physical weight. She walked to the center of the arena floor and stood beside her son. Kaelin looked at her. She looked at him. Up close, with the arena's specific light on his face, he looked like what he was. A young wolf of 14 standing in a space that he had the right to stand in, carrying capability that had been developed in the cold of the mountains over years of hard mornings, and the particular steadiness of a person who has known for a long time that this moment was coming and has not spent the intervening time being afraid of it. Lucian came off the arena's edge and stood on her other side without being asked, without looking to her for confirmation. He simply moved to where he was supposed to be, with the quiet certainty of a person who has known where he was supposed to be from the beginning. She looked up at the royal gallery. Theron was standing. Vesper was standing beside him, and her hand was no longer on his arm, and the distance between them had the quality of distance that opens between two people when one of them has just understood something that the other hoped they never would. Seraphine looked at the man she had loved for 4 years and left 14 years ago, and had not looked at directly in all the time between, and she felt not what she'd been afraid she would feel, not the old wound reopening, not the particular grief of the watchtower and the rainstorm in the hand over hers. She felt something colder and cleaner than any of that, the specific sensation of a person who has spent a long time carrying something heavy and has arrived at the place where they can put it down. She opened the leather case. She took out the first document. Alpha King, she said, and her voice carried in the arena the way voices carry when the space is designed for it, and the person using it has spent 14 years making sure their voice does not shake. I invoke the open trial's witness right. I have evidence to present to this court, and I have two individuals on this floor whose identity is a matter of law, record, and bloodline that this court has the right and the obligation to recognize. Theron looked at Kaelin. He looked at Lucian. He looked at their faces. His own face on his son's, the bone structure he'd passed on, and the specific quality of alpha capacity that was not a thing you could fake or develop through training, that existed in the marrow and spoke to others of the same blood in a language that predated every political system that had tried to put it to use. He looked at Seraphine. In the royal gallery, Vesper Rowan moved. Not subtly, not with the precision of managed court maneuvering. She moved with the abruptness of a person whose carefully maintained positions have just become untenable simultaneously, whose 8 years of structure are in the process of revealing themselves as exactly as fragile as things built on a foundation of one person's ignorance always are the moment that ignorance ends. She said something to the guard beside her. Seraphine couldn't hear it from the arena floor, but she could see the guard's face, and the guard's face had the expression of a man being given an order that he is not certain he should follow, and Seraphine understood in that moment what order Vesper had just given, and she understood that they were out of time. "Kaelin," she said very quietly. "I see it," he said. "Lucian." "Already counting," Lucian said. She looked up at her king, the man who had been her king once, who had made the specific catastrophic decision that people make when they believe their certainty is the same thing as their rightness. And she looked at him with the full weight of 14 years and put the document on the ground in front of her and covered it with her boot and said, "Whatever happens in the next 60 seconds, your decision is in front of you. It always was." The guard in the royal gallery moved toward the stairs. And the arena, 3,000 wolves and every pack in Veilthorn, and 14 years of accumulated truth arriving at the single point where it either becomes history or gets buried, held its breath. The guard on the gallery stairs took 3 steps and stopped. Not because anyone ordered him to stop, because Theron Blackridge turned and looked at him with the specific quality of attention that Alpha Kings develop over 20 years of absolute authority. The look that doesn't threaten, doesn't warn, doesn't perform any of the theatrics of power, but simply makes absolutely clear that the person receiving it has reached the boundary of what is permitted. And the guard stopped. Vesper said something. Low, controlled, the voice she used when she was managing a situation that was becoming unmanageable. Theron didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the guard for 2 full seconds, and the guard stayed where he was. And then Theron turned back to the arena floor and looked down at the 3 people standing at its center. The woman he had spent 14 years not thinking about with any honesty, and the 2 young wolves on either side of her whose faces were doing something to his chest that he did not yet have language for. The arena waited. 3,000 wolves in the particular silence of an assembly that understands it is witnessing something that will be described later, to children, to pack members who weren't present, to the historical record that every significant court event eventually becomes. They had come for a kingdom trial, and were getting something older and less manageable. And the crowd's instinct, which was the instinct of wolves who had lived under pack structure long enough to understand what moments of genuine power transfer felt like, was to be very still. Theron descended from the royal gallery, not with ceremony, not with the processional gravity of official court movement. He came down the gallery stairs and through the official observer's corridor and out onto the arena floor with the directness of a man who has decided to close a distance and is not interested in the performance of closing it. He stopped 10 feet from Seraphine. Up close, the 14 years were more specific. She had known, in the abstract, that he would be older, that the silver at his temples would have spread, that his face would carry the particular mapping of long stress in ways that youth doesn't show. She had known it, and she had not known it, the way you can know something completely in the abstract and still find the concrete version of it arriving with more weight than you prepared for. He looked at Kaelin. He looked at Lucian. He looked at their faces, his own architecture and their bone structure, the jaw, the forehead, the specific set of the eyes that were hers in color, but his in shape. And Seraphine watched the knowledge arrive in him the way it arrives in people when the thing they're being shown is not a surprise, but a confirmation of something their body already understood before their mind was ready to receive it. "How old?" he said. His voice was level. She gave him credit for that. 14, she said. Both of them. 4 minutes apart. He absorbed this. She watched him do it. The compression of the intake, the processing of a fact that restructured the past 14 years in a single sentence. He was an intelligent man. Whatever else he was, he had always been that. He didn't require the mathematics to be walked through. "You knew," he said, "at the ceremony." 6 weeks, she said. The distance between them held the weight of 14 years of everything that had and hadn't been said. She had imagined this moment in various configurations over the years, not obsessively, not with the morbid rehearsal of someone who cannot let go, but with the practical forethought of a woman who understood that it was coming and that she needed to know what she was going to do with it when it arrived. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for grief. She had prepared for the version where seeing him in person unraveled the careful architecture she'd built around the original wound. What she felt, standing 10 feet from him on the arena floor with her sons beside her, and 3,000 wolves watching, was something she hadn't prepared for because it didn't have the dramatic weight that she'd associated with this confrontation in her imagination. She felt clear, not healed, but that was too simple, and she had spent enough time in the mountain territory to distrust simple resolutions. But clear, the way high altitude produces clarity, the way cold, clean air produces it, a state of seeing without the distortion of accumulated feeling. She had carried the weight for 14 years. She had carried it across 3 days of mountain road and 40 miles of night riding and 6 unconscious men on a forest floor. She had carried it up every hard morning and through every hard conversation and into every decision she'd made about who her sons were going to be. She was done carrying it, not because it didn't matter, because she was setting it down in the one place where it could become something other than a wound. In the open, in front of witnesses, where it was no longer a private grief but a public truth. And public truth is the only kind that has the power to change the structures that produced it. She reached down and picked up the first document from where she'd covered it with her boot. She held it out. He took it. He read it. She watched his face while he read, and thought about the watchtower, and thought about his hand over hers, and thought about how young she'd been, and how certain, and she thought, that certainty wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete. She had read a moment correctly, and a man incorrectly, and the cost of that misreading had been enormous, and had also, in the specific perverse arithmetic of consequences, produced the 2 people currently standing beside her who were the best things she had ever done. She did not thank him for the misreading. She was not going to do that. But she acknowledged it, in the privacy of her own chest, as a fact about the world. That the worst things that happen to you and the best things that come from you are sometimes the same event, viewed from different distances. Their unfinished reading, he looked up. His face had done something in the time it took to read the document. Not collapsed, not broken, but changed in the specific way that faces change when a person stops performing the version of themselves they've been maintaining and makes contact, however briefly, with the actual version underneath. It was not a comfortable face. It was the face of a man who has just been handed evidence of the full scope of what his certainty has cost. Corden Ashby, Seraphine said, has 14 years of documentation, court records, administrative evidence, testimony from 8 witnesses who are currently in this arena. He will present it to whatever judicial body this court convenes. Theron looked past her, found Corden in the observers section. Corden met his eyes with the directness of a man who has finally put down the long, careful weight of loyalty to a king who wasn't looking where he was walking. How long? Theron said to Corden. Not the ceremony, not the Luna. How long had he not known what was happening in his own court? 8 years that I can document, Corden said. Possibly longer. Theron was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he turned and looked up at the royal gallery. Vesper Rowan stood at the gallery railing with both hands resting on it and her face wearing the last version of composure she had access to. The performance of it, stripped now of the genuine ease that had always lived underneath the performance before, leaving just the structure of it, the scaffolding without the building. She was calculating. Seraphine could see it from the arena floor, the rapid internal assessment of remaining options, remaining leverage, remaining positions that hadn't been cut off by the last 15 minutes. She was finding very few. Theron said, at a volume the gallery could hear, "Come down." It was not a request. Vesper descended with the measured pace of a woman who is controlling the only variable she has left, how she moves through the final stages of something she can no longer stop. She came out onto the arena floor and stood with the distance of 10 feet between herself and Theron and 15 feet between herself and Seraphine, and she looked at Seraphine with the particular expression of one very intelligent woman looking at another who has just outmaneuvered her, and Seraphine looked back and felt nothing dramatic, just the clean recognition of a long game reaching its conclusion. "You built something real," Vesper said. It was not an apology. It was the assessment of a professional. "I spent 8 years building a position, and you spent 14 building people. I should have accounted for the difference." "You should have," Seraphine agreed. Theron looked at Vesper for a long moment. The look of a man who is seeing a person clearly for the first time and understanding that the version he had known was not the full version, that there had always been more operating beneath the surface than he'd been permitted to see, and that he had been complicit in not seeing it by virtue of not looking, not asking, not insisting on the kind of truth that requires work to receive. "Every policy reversal," he said. It was not quite a question. "The ones that benefited my family's territories," Vesper said without inflection. "Yes." "The advisors. The ones who would have told you things I didn't want you to hear. Yes." "The assassination was planned," she said, "for tonight, during the final elimination round, chaos, emergency authority transfer, succession resolution." She glanced at Kaelin and Lucien. "Before they became something you'd already seen." The silence that followed was total and had considerable depth. Theron looked at his hands. It was a brief gesture, barely visible. The look of a man checking his own grip, metaphorically, assessing what he's been holding and how, and what it's done to the shape of his hands over the years of holding it wrong. Then he straightened. "Remove her to the council chamber," he said to the arena guard. "Full documentation to be presented, full judicial proceeding under the Pax Charter." He looked at Vesper. "Everything." Vesper went with the guards without resistance. This, too, was the calculation of a professional. She had enough remaining intelligence to understand that resistance now created the image that damaged her most, and that the only remaining leverage she had was the image of a woman who accepted consequences with composure, which was not much leverage but was all that was left. She did not look at Seraphine on the way out. Seraphine did not watch her go. She was watching Theron, who had turned back to her and to her sons, and whose face had arrived at something that she recognized as the expression a person gets when they are standing in the wreckage of their own decisions and have just understood the full scope of what they built badly and what it destroyed when it came down. It was not a comfortable thing to look at. She had never taken pleasure in other people's reckonings, even when those people had given her cause. Pleasure in another person's pain was a form of continuing to let that person define your emotional life, and she had stopped letting Theron Blackridge define her emotional life approximately 14 years ago on a mountain road in the cold dark. He crouched down, not to the documents, to the level of Kaelin and Lucien, not all the way. He was a tall man and they were not small, but a deliberate reduction of his own physical authority, the specific gesture of a person who is choosing diminishment rather than having it forced on them. He looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked back at him with the steady, unblinking assessment that was his most consistent quality, the quality that had unnerved the Eastern recruit in the arena an hour ago and would go on unnerving people for the rest of his life. "What do you know about me?" Theron said. Kaelin took a moment. Seraphine watched him decide how honest to be and then decide to be all the way honest, which was the choice she'd always hoped he'd make in this specific situation, but hadn't known until this moment that he would. "That you were good at this once," Kaelin said, "and then you stopped paying attention, and that the difference between a good king and a failed one is sometimes just that, the attention." Theron absorbed this. He looked at Lucien. Lucien said, "I want to know what you were going to do. If you'd known about us from the beginning." The question landed with the weight of everything it contained. 14 years of mountain mornings and hard conditions, and a mother's consistent refusal to let bitterness become the architecture of her son's understanding of the world. And underneath all of it, the plain human need to know if it would have mattered. Theron was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally, "and that's the truest thing I can tell you. I don't know, and I've spent 20 years being certain about things I should have held more carefully, and I'm not going to stand in front of you and be certain about this." Lucien looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but the acknowledgement of a person recognizing honesty when they encounter it, which was its own kind of respect. Seraphine watched her sons with their father and felt the circuit close. Not cleanly. Nothing that has been open for 14 years closes cleanly. But it closed. The judicial proceedings took 3 days. Corden presented the 8 years of documented evidence to a council of pack elders convened under the pack's charter, the most ancient judicial authority in Valethorn, predating the kingdom's current structure, convened specifically because the offenses involved the Alpha King's own court, and therefore could not be adjudicated by any body that had operated within it. Seraphine presented the birth documentation. The bloodline attestation. The sealed correspondence that Corden had maintained over 14 years with the care of a man who understood that some records needed to exist in the world with the same permanence as the facts they documented. Every document was verified. Every witness was heard. The pack elders deliberated for 4 hours and delivered their findings in the arena, in the same space where Kaelin had invoked the witness right, in front of the same assembly that had been present then, plus a significant number of additional wolves who had arrived in the intervening 3 days as word moved through the capital with the speed that significant events always move, the way water moves through stone when it finds the crack. Vesper Rowan was found guilty of systematic administrative corruption, unauthorized policy manipulation, conspiracy to falsify the Luna ceremony circumstances, and conspiracy to commit assassination against the kingdom's rightful heirs. Her family's political privileges were revoked. Her territorial holdings in the mountain passes were placed under kingdom administration pending restructuring. She was sentenced to 7 years of supervised exile in the Eastern Territories, under pack elder oversight, with a permanent bar from court appointment. She heard the sentence in the arena with the same composure she had maintained throughout. Not genuine ease, not anymore, but the practiced composure of a woman who had made a very large, calculated bet and had lost it with professional understanding of what losing meant. She did not argue the findings. She did not make a speech. She looked at Seraphine once, briefly, before the guards moved her from the floor. The look said, "Well played." Seraphine didn't respond to it. The game framing was Vesper's, not hers. She hadn't been playing a game for 14 years. She had been building a life and building sons, and maintaining the long, unglamorous patience of a person who understands that truth is not the fastest thing in the world, but it is among the most durable. Theron's public accounting came after the judicial proceedings. He requested it himself. Seraphine had not asked for it. She had not been planning to ask for it, had not included it in any of her calculations about what the resolution of this situation needed to look like, because she had learned a long time ago that the accounting of powerful men tends to be performed rather than genuine, and that performed accountability is worse than no accountability at all, because it takes up the space where real change would otherwise have to go. But Theron requested it. He stood in the arena on the 4th day with the crown on his head and the full assembly present, and delivered the most uncomfortable speech Seraphine had ever heard a powerful man give, which made it, in its way, the most important one. He did not use the word mistake. He used the word choice, consistently, because choices carry weight that mistakes don't. Mistakes imply accident, imply limited agency, imply that the person making them was not fully present in the making. He had been fully present. He had chosen Vesper Rowan knowing what he was choosing away from. He had chosen isolation from accurate information because accurate information from the people who had it was information he didn't want to hear. He had chosen the certainty that his judgment was adequate over the harder, less comfortable work of maintaining the connections that would have supplemented it. He said, "I rejected the woman who was building my kingdom's future while I was dismantling it. I rejected her because she told me true things, and I preferred convenient ones, and I dressed that preference in the language of strategy, until I could no longer tell the difference between what was strategic and what was merely self-serving. He said, "The heirs of this kingdom were raised in the mountains by the one person who had the most cause to poison them against it, and she raised them instead to care about it enough to come back. That is a quality of character that I cannot claim credit for and do not intend to." He said, "I am asking this assembly not for restoration of confidence, but for the opportunity to demonstrate through action rather than speech that what I am capable of now is more honest than what I was capable of then. I understand if that demonstration takes the rest of my life. It should." The arena was very quiet during this speech. Seraphine stood in the observers section with Marin beside her and listened, and felt the specific sensation of watching a person do the hardest thing a person can do. Not the dramatic hard thing, the battlefield hard thing, but the interior hard thing, the confrontation with the full true shape of what you've done without the softening of self-justification. She did not feel satisfaction, exactly. She felt something more complicated and less easy to name. The recognition that the man she had loved at 26 had been real, had been capable of this honesty even then, and that the waste of it was exactly as large as it looked from where she was standing, and that the largeness of the waste did not mean that what was happening now was worthless. Late that evening, the fourth day, after the proceedings were concluded and the assembly dispersed and the capital began the slow work of resuming normal function that cities do after significant events, Theron found her in the eastern courtyard. Not the ceremonial courtyard, the working one, the one with the frost-stiff grass and the stable entrance on the far wall, the one she'd stood in 14 years ago with her hand against the cold stone and managed herself back from the edge of something she couldn't afford to become. She was sitting on the courtyard wall, not performing anything, just sitting in the cold with her coat and her thoughts and the specific quality of tiredness that comes after a sustained effort that has finally reached its conclusion. The clean tired, the tired that means something is done. He stopped a respectful distance from her. He had learned something about distance in the past 4 days, or he was trying to. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "You don't have to answer it." "Ask," she said. "Were you angry the whole time?" She thought about this honestly, because dishonesty in this specific conversation served nothing. "For the first year," she said, "maybe 18 months. The anger was... yes, it was significant." She looked at the courtyard wall. "After that, I was mostly busy." He was quiet. "The boys," he said. "What I said in the arena. What I'm going to say to the pack elders tomorrow about the succession. I'm not trying to buy something with it. I want you to know that." "I know," she said. She did know. She had watched him carefully for 4 days with the same eyes she'd used to watch territorial negotiations and border disputes and every other situation where what people said and what they wanted were potentially different things. And she had not detected the performance in him. What she'd detected was more uncomfortable than performance. Genuine reckoning, genuine cost, the specific quality of a man paying something that can't be paid in installments. "I'm not coming back," she said, "to court. As Luna, as counsel, as any formal position. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "My sons will do what they decide to do. Kalen will lead. That's what he is. I've known it since he was 6 years old. Lucien will be whatever Kalen needs beside him, which will turn out to be more than either of them currently understands." She paused. "They don't need me in this court to do that. They need me alive and well and somewhere they know I am, which I intend to be." "Where?" he said. "The mountain territory," she said. "My mother's land. It's mine now in practice. She stepped back from active leadership 2 years ago. It needs someone to run it, and I know how to run it, and it's where I built the thing I'm most proud of." A pause. "Those two. That's what I built there. Everything else is secondary." He looked at the courtyard, at the frost-stiff grass, at the stable entrance on the far wall. He was seeing the same space she was sitting in, but she had the private knowledge of what this specific courtyard had looked like 14 years ago in the 3rd hour of the morning, the way the torchlight from the arena had painted the sky amber above the walls, the way the cold had smelled like coming winter. She did not tell him about that. It was hers. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. She had prepared, over the years, various responses to the possibility of those two words from this specific man. She had prepared the version where they arrived too late to matter, and the version where they arrived in the wrong form, packaged in justification, or diminished by context, or inflated into something more dramatic than sincerity. She had prepared for the version that felt manipulative, and the version that felt genuine, and the version that she couldn't tell the difference on. This was the version she hadn't fully prepared for. He said it quietly, without theater, without the weight of a man who expects something in return for the saying of it. Just 2 words in the cold of a working courtyard, from a man who had been doing the math on himself for 4 days and had arrived at a number that was honest. She sat with it. "I know," she said. Not, "It's all right." Not, "I forgive you." Not any of the formulas that people reach for in these moments, because the formulas take the pressure off and let everyone breathe more easily, but don't actually do the work that the moment is asking for. Just, "I know." Meaning, "I believe you." Meaning, the apology is real and I receive it as real, and I'm not going to pretend that receiving it resolves everything it should resolve, but I'm not going to refuse it either, because refusing it would mean still letting this define me, and I stopped letting this define me a long time ago in the mountains, and I am not going back. He nodded. They sat in the courtyard for a few minutes more, in the particular silence of 2 people who have said the most necessary things and have arrived, not at peace exactly, but at a kind of settlement. The specific sensation of a long account being closed, not zeroed out, not made equal, but closed, because keeping it open no longer serves anything. Then he went inside, and she sat on the wall a while longer in the cold and looked at the amber-painted sky above the stable roof and breathed the coming winter air that smelled like mountains even here, even in the capital, when the wind was right, and she let herself feel the weight of what had been set down. It was considerable. She had not known, until she put it down, how heavy it had been. The succession was formalized on the 6th day. Theron stood before the pack elders and the assembled court and spoke the formal transference of authority with the same voice he used for everything, level, certain, unhurried, but the certainty had a different quality now. Not the certainty of a man who has never been shaken, but the certainty of a man who has been shaken to the foundation and has spent 4 days determining which parts of the foundation actually hold and which parts were always performance, and has decided to build only on the parts that hold. He transferred primary governance authority to Kaelin and Lucian Ashvale Blackridge. Both names. He insisted on both names, which Seraphine had not asked him to do, and which cost him something she could see in his face when he said it. The specific cost of naming publicly what you failed privately, of putting your mistake into the official record where it becomes history rather than private shame that can be managed and diminished. Kaelin accepted the authority with the gravity of someone who has been preparing for it for years without calling it that. He stood in front of the pack elders at 14 years old and looked older than 14 in the specific way that people look older when they have been learning hard things in earnest from an early age. And he said the acceptance words clearly and without performance, and then looked at Lucian, and the communication between them was, as always, compressed and total. Lucian said the co-governance oath with his hand on his brother's shoulder and his eyes steady, and Seraphine watched from the observers section and felt something that she had no name for that was warm in her chest, and not uncomplicated and exactly right. She had built this. Not alone. Marin had helped build it, and her mother, and Gula, and the packmaster Aldrich, who had trained them and who had been located and questioned and had confirmed, with considerable distress, that he had mentioned Marin's contact at the way station during an apparently innocent conversation with a traitor who had turned out not to be a traitor. He had not known. He had not known, and it had cost them, and he had spent the 3 days of judicial proceedings looking like a man sitting inside a mistake he would carry for a long time. And Seraphine had told him, when she found a moment, that he was not the architect of what had gone wrong, and that his 14 years of genuine loyalty were not cancelled by an unwitting conversation with a woman who was a professional at extracting information from people who didn't realize they were being extracted from. He had looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he wasn't sure he deserved. She had meant it. That was the thing about the mountain territory and the people in it. They had given her, over 14 years, a way of understanding loyalty that didn't require it to be perfect, to be real. Loyalty that is only valid when it never fails is not loyalty. It's performance under favorable conditions. Real loyalty is what Marin had done, and what Aldrich had done, and what Corden Ashby had done when he'd sent 9 words with 0 days of hesitation and 4 days of hard writing. Real loyalty is what people do when the doing costs them, and it was not invalidated by a single point of failure that they hadn't created. Seraphine had spent 14 years being the recipient of that kind of loyalty. She understood what it was worth. In the weeks that followed the succession, the capital reorganized around its new governing structure with the efficiency of a system that had been straining against inadequate management and was now experiencing the specific relief of being correctly handled. Kaelin moved through administrative problems with the directness of someone who had been trained to identify the actual problem rather than the presenting symptom, and the solutions he implemented tended to be simpler than the existing structures they replaced, which was the hallmark of someone who understood that complexity in governance is usually a feature of systems designed to obscure rather than function. Lucien worked differently. He spent 3 weeks in the affected Riverpack territories before he made any administrative recommendation about the famine conditions, traveling with a small group and no significant escort, staying in the territories themselves rather than receiving reports about them, because Seraphine had taught him, not directly, through the consistent pattern of her own behavior, that you cannot understand a problem you have only read about, and that the people most affected by a failure of governance are the people whose assessment of it is most accurate, and that accurate assessment requires proximity. He came back with a detailed understanding of what the Riverpacks needed and why the current relief structure wasn't delivering it, and what specifically would have to change to fix that. And his presentation to the Provisional Council was the most specific thing the Council had heard in years, and the older pack elders, the ones who had been in governance long enough to understand the difference between a report and an understanding, looked at him with something that was the beginning of trust. Dramkalok's rebel faction in the desert basin was handled through Kaelin's first major territorial negotiation. He went himself, again with minimal escort, into the desert basin to sit across from a man who had formed a rebel faction because his pack's trading rights had been stripped in a tariff dispute that should never have happened, and he told Kalok directly that the dispute had been unjust, that the authority that had created it had been illegitimate, and that he was there to rebuild the trading arrangement that should have existed all along. Kalok was a practical man. He had formed the rebel faction not from ideology but from need, and practical men who act from need will consider practical solutions when practical solutions are put in front of them by someone who is clearly not performing practicality but meaning it. The faction disbanded within the month. Seraphine was in the mountain territory when she received the report. She had returned 2 weeks after the succession, quietly, without ceremony, without any of the processing that other people seemed to expect she might need to perform publicly about what she was leaving behind again. She had said goodbye to her sons in the courtyard on a morning when the first light was just touching the capital's western roofline, and Kaelin had looked at her with his steady, unreadable face and then embraced her with a completeness that said everything he wasn't saying, and Lucien had said, "We'll come to the mountain territory in the spring," and she had said, "I'll be there." And that had been sufficient for all 3 of them. She had said goodbye to Marin in the same courtyard, and this had been harder because Marin had chosen to stay. Not for the court, not for any remaining professional function, but for Kaelin and Lucien, who were 14 and navigating a governance structure and a court that was still in the process of being restructured, and who needed someone near them who had known them since before they were born and had no agenda other than their well-being. Marin was 71 and had more energy than most 50-year-olds and would outlast most expectations about her capacities, and she had looked at Seraphine in the courtyard and said, "Go home." And Seraphine had understood that Marin was telling her something true, that the mountain territory was home now in a way that the capital had never been, had always been borrowed rather than belonging, and that going back to it was not retreat but return. She had ridden north without looking back. The mountain territory in early winter was exactly what it had always been, hard-aired and spare and beautiful in the particular way of places that don't accommodate softness, that require you to be what you actually are, rather than what you've been performing. The creek behind the territory hall ran cold and fast with the snow melt from the high country. Her mother's fire was going when she arrived, and Alara Ashvale opened the door before she'd finished dismounting, which meant she'd been watching the road, which meant she'd been expecting this, which was her mother's consistent quality, the expectation of her daughter's arrivals without ever specifically preparing for them, just maintaining the readiness of a woman who knows her people and knows when they're coming home. They didn't talk much that first evening. They sat by the fire, and her mother asked practical questions about the territorial administrative transfer, who had been assigned to what function, how the Pack Elder Provisional Council was structured, whether Corden Ashby had been retained in any official capacity. And Seraphine answered them in the spare informational way she'd always used with her mother, because Alara Ashvale received information better than she received emotion. And love in the Ashvale family had always been expressed through interest in each other's practical circumstances, rather than through any of the softer demonstrations. Eventually, after the fire had burned lower and the cold outside the windows had settled into the specific cold of high altitude in deep evening, Alara said, "And you? And me?" Seraphine said, "Are you all right?" She thought about it. The honest version. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I'm clear. I feel clear." Her mother looked at her for a moment with the assessing eye she used for everything, the look that had been evaluating Seraphine's answers for as long as Seraphine had been giving them. "Good," she said. And that was the Ashvale family's version of a thorough emotional debrief, and it was exactly what Seraphine needed. The spring came the way spring comes in the mountain territory. Not gently, not the slow warming of lowland springs, but in fits and starts, warm days followed by late frost, the high altitude's refusal to commit to any season until it's absolutely ready. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. The thin pale green that Seraphine had noticed from a way station window 14 years ago came back in the same slow way, the same cold persistence of things that know what they are and come back anyway. Kaylin and Lucien rode up in the 4th week of spring, as Lucien had promised. They came alone. No escort, no court formality. Just 2 young wolves on mountain horses, road dirty in the way that people get when they've been riding for 4 days and don't mind it, arriving through the territory gate in the early afternoon with the ease of people coming to a place they know. She met them in the courtyard. Kaylin was taller than when she'd last seen him. 3 months had done something to the angle of his jaw, or she was seeing it differently now, seeing it without the overlay of everything that had preceded the resolution, seeing it clean. He looked like himself, like the specific version of himself that all the preceding versions had been building toward, the final architecture becoming visible. Lucien had his maps. Of course he had his maps. He'd brought 3 of them, territorial maps of the Riverpack regions he'd been working in, because Lucien Ashvale did not go anywhere without a map and did not take a vacation that he couldn't use to also understand the territory he was standing in. He spread them on the territory hall table within 20 minutes of arriving and started explaining the Riverpack restructuring with the enthusiasm of someone who has been doing work that genuinely interests them. And Seraphine sat across from him and listened and asked questions. And it was, she thought, exactly what a spring visit should feel like. Kaylin sat at the end of the table and watched his brother talk about his work and watched his mother listen. And after a while he looked at Seraphine with the expression she had never found a name for. The seen-through expression, the complete one, and said quietly, underneath Lucien's explanation of the Eastern Tributary water rights problem, "You're good." "I am," she said. "Really?" "Yes," she said. "Really." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, the same nod Lucien had given his father in the arena, the acknowledgement of honesty recognized. "Good," he said. And they left it there because they were Ashvales, and leaving things where they'd been clearly stated was their way, and because nothing more needed to be said about it, and because the maps were interesting and the Riverpack problem was solvable, and the spring was coming in hard and clear outside the territory hall windows, and Seraphine had things to do. She always had things to do. Theron sent a message in the summer, not a formal communication, not court correspondence, not an official dispatch. A letter in his own hand, which she recognized from 14 years ago when he'd written things in the strategy room at 2 a.m. with ink on his hands. The handwriting was the same. Slightly more controlled now, or maybe just older, the hand of a man who had learned to be more deliberate about the marks he made. He wrote, "I am working. I understand now that working is the only form of apology that has any meaning. I wanted you to know." She read it once. She put it on the table. She sat with the fact of it for a while. A man who had cost her 14 years of a different life, spending the rest of his own life trying to justify the cost through something other than words, which was the most honest arrangement she could imagine for both of them. She wrote back 3 sentences. She wrote, "I know you are. What you do with what's left matters more than what you did with what's past. My sons are good. You can take nothing from that and should try to deserve it." She sent it. Then she went out to the Territory Hall's eastern field where the new training arrangement was being set up. 3 young wolves from the local pack who had been asking her since her return whether she would take them on, whether she would run the same program she'd run with Kaelin and Lucian, whether what she'd built with her sons was something she could build again. She had thought about it for 6 weeks. She had decided yes. Not to replace what she'd built with her sons. Nothing replaced that. Nothing was trying to. But because the mountain territory produced a certain kind of person, the high altitude and the hard conditions and the specific demands of living above the timberline where the world didn't accommodate weakness, and that kind of person needed the right kind of development, or they became something that their circumstances had made necessary, but that they didn't have to remain. She had spent 14 years building something in the cold. She understood the process now. She understood what it required, the patience of it, the daily recommitment of it, the specific work of building instinct rather than information, of teaching through situation rather than instruction, of trusting that people with the right foundation will grow toward what they're capable of without being forced toward it. She had the time. She had the territory. She had the specific hard-won knowledge of someone who has been through the worst version of their own story and come out the other side, not unscathed, not unchanged, but intact. The particular integrity of a person whose core did not break under the weight of what was put on it, who arrived at the far side of a long, hard passage, still recognizably themselves, maybe more themselves than they had been before it. She walked out to the eastern field in the summer morning with the cold coming down from the altitude above, and the thin high-altitude grass underfoot, and the creek loud in the middle distance, and 3 young wolves waiting for her by the fence line. And she thought about the watchtower and the rainstorm and his hand over hers, and the ceremony and the courtyard and the mountain road in the cold dark, and Gula's hands and 2 heartbeats, and 14 years of hard mornings, and the arena and the document on the ground, and the 9 words, and the guard on the stairs, and her sons standing on either side of her on the arena floor with the assembly holding its breath. She thought about all of it in the 30 seconds it took her to cross the field. Then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, because it was finished. Because the story of what had been done to her had run its full length and arrived at its true ending, which was not revenge and was not restoration and was not even justice, exactly. It was something simpler and harder to name, the thing that happens when a person who has been defined by someone else's decision finally, completely, undeniably outgrows the definition. She was 40 years old. She had her territory and her mountain and her sons in the kingdom below, doing the work she'd raised them to do with the values she'd built into them, through 14 years of consistent example, and her mother in the hall behind her with the fire going and opinions about everything, and Marin sending letters from the capital with updates about the administrative restructuring that were thorough and precise and occasionally dry in a way that made Seraphine laugh out loud when she read them alone. She had the 3 young wolves by the fence line who needed what she knew how to give. She had work. She stopped at the fence line and looked at the 3 of them, young, watchful, trying to appear less nervous than they were. And she said, "First thing, whatever you think you know about what's hard, you don't know yet. I'm going to show you what's hard, and then I'm going to show you that you can do it. Those are the only 2 things I'm going to show you. Everything else you'll figure out yourself." The tallest one said, "What if we can't do it?" She looked at him with the specific clear eyes of a woman who has crossed 3 days of mountain road in the dark and raised 2 heirs in the cold and walked into a kingdom that discarded her and put the truth on the ground in front of 10,000 wolves and said, "You will." The creek ran cold and fast in the middle distance. The altitude air came down clean from the high country. The summer morning was bright and hard and clear. She climbed the fence and began.